In a world that often measures worth by productivity and appearance, the most profound stories emerge from the most unexpected places. This is the story of a forgotten farm horse, deemed worthless by those who once valued him, and the small boy, who saw beyond the scars and weariness. Their journey together would challenge not only a community's perception, but redefine what it means to believe in second chances. Sometimes, the greatest teachers come with 4 legs and a broken spirit, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Burlington County Livestock Auction hummed with the practiced chaos of commerce on that crisp October morning. Wealthy farm owners in pressed shirts mingled with weathered ranchers, their conversations punctuated by the auctioneer's rhythmic calls and the occasional whinny from the holding pens. The air carried the distinct blend of hay, animal musk, and ambition that defined these gatherings. In the center display pen, separated from the prize breeding stock and young colts, stood a large Belgian draft horse. Once a magnificent example of his breed, his massive frame now seemed to collapse in on itself, as though the very effort of standing taxed what little strength remained. His chestnut coat, dulled by neglect, hung loosely over protruding ribs and hip bones. A network of scars crossed his flanks and shoulders, telling stories of hard labor and harsher treatment. Next up, lot number 47, the auctioneer announced, his enthusiasm noticeably dimming as the spotlight swung to illuminate the draft horse. Belgian gelding, age approximately 12 years, previous farm work experience. The clinical description did nothing to capture the animal's condition. The horse's head hung low, his once powerful legs positioned awkwardly as though each hoof and carried an invisible weight. Most telling were his eyes, flat, vacant windows that seemed to look at nothing and expect even less. Do I hear an opening bid? Folks, this is a Belgian draft, good for farm work, or... The auctioneer paused, searching for something positive to highlight. Salvage value at the very least. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few chuckles broke the silence, followed by whispered comments that grew bolder as the moment stretched. "Oh, that's not a horse, that's a walking glue factory," someone called out from the back, triggering a ripple of laughter. "My daughter's pony has more pulling power than that bag of bones," added another voice. From the premium seats, a woman in expensive riding attire leaned toward her companion. "I don't understand why they even brought him in. Looks like he's given up on life entirely." The auctioneer tried again. "Come now, folks. Starting bid at 200, 150. The silence was punctuated only by more murmurs and the occasional derisive snort. The Belgian stood motionless, seemingly unaware of his public rejection, his gaze fixed on some middle distance where the opinions of humans held no significance. 100 then. Surely someone needs... The auctioneer's voice trailed off as handlers prepared to move the horse out, another failed lot to be dealt with after the day's proceedings. Near the back of the auction hall, 7-year-old Mason Reynolds watched the scene unfold, his small hands gripping the wooden railing that separated spectators from the auction floor. Unlike the adults around him, Mason's attention had been captured by the Belgian from the moment the massive horse had been led into the ring. While others saw worthlessness, the boy saw something entirely different. "Dad," Mason tugged urgently at his father's sleeve. "Dad, look at him." Thomas Reynolds glanced down at his son, then followed the boy's gaze to the dejected horse. A widower, who managed a small family orchard, Thomas had brought Mason to the auction to observe, perhaps to purchase a pony in the spring if business improved. The Belgian draft horse was the furthest thing from what they needed or could afford. "That's not for us, buddy," Thomas said gently. "That's a working horse that's past his prime. We don't have the space or the... He needs us, Dad." Mason interrupted, his voice carrying a certainty that belied his years. "Nobody else wants him." Thomas recognized the look in his son's eyes, the same determined expression Mason had worn when he'd insisted on nursing an injured robin back to health last spring, spending weeks feeding it with an eyedropper. The same look he'd had when he'd declared he would learn to read above his grade level after a teacher suggested he might need remedial help. Mason, that horse is likely sick, definitely undernourished, and possibly dangerous, Thomas tried to reason. We know nothing about handling draft horses. But Mason wasn't listening. The auctioneer had moved on, declaring the lot unsold, and handlers were approaching to lead the Belgian away to whatever fate awaited unwanted livestock. $50. The high, clear voice cut through the auction. All, stopping conversations mid-sentence, all heads turned toward the source of the bid. Mason stood with his hand raised high, his small frame barely visible above the railing. I have $50. From my birthday and chores and tooth fairy money, the boy continued, pulling a carefully folded wad of bills from his pocket. I want to buy that horse. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then recovered with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to unusual situations. I have $50 from the young gentleman in the back. Do I hear 75? The hall remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. What had been dismissive disinterest transformed into curious observation. Parents pulled children closer, whispering explanations. A few people craned their necks to get a better look at the small boy with the impossible bid. Thomas knelt beside, his son, speaking in an urgent whisper. Mason, we can't afford to care for a horse like that. The feed alone would— I'll pay for it, Mason insisted, his eyes never leaving the Belgian. I'll work extra chores. I can help more in the orchard. Please, Dad, no one else is going to help him. Something in his son's plea reached past Thomas's practical concerns. Perhaps it was the echo of his late wife's compassion that he often saw in Mason, or perhaps it was simply the undeniable fact that the horse's fate without intervention would likely be grim. $50 going once, the auctioneer called, scanning the crowd. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, calculations and consequences racing through his mind. $50 going twice? Wait. Thomas stood up, his hand on Mason's shoulder. We'll take him. The gavel fell with a decisive crack. Sold, to the young man and his father in the back. As they made their way to the payment office, they passed through whispers and stares. Some expressions held amusement, others skepticism, and a few showed something like respect. An older rancher shook his head as they passed. That horse is one step from the knacker's yard, son, he told Thomas. You're throwing good money after bad. Mason looked up at the man, his expression solemn. His name is Titan, he said with quiet certainty, though the horse had been presented with no name at all. And he's going to get better with us. Later, as they waited for Titan to be loaded into a borrowed trailer, Mason stood watching the Belgian with unwavering attention. The horse remained, as he had been in the auction ring, motionless, distant, his massive body a shell housing what seemed to be a departed spirit. Thomas signed the last of the paperwork, wondering not for the first time that day if he had made a terrible mistake. Their small orchard had a modest stable meant for a pony or riding horse, not a draft animal. They had no experience with rehabilitation, and the veterinary bills alone could strain their careful budget. And yet, watching his son approach the trailer with sure, careful steps, Thomas felt something unexpected, a flicker of his son's certainty taking root in his own heart. "Hey, Titan," Mason said softly, standing at a respectful distance from the trailer. "I'm Mason. We're going to be friends." For the briefest moment, so brief that Thomas would later wonder if he had imagined it, the Belgian's ear twitched. In the boy's direction, the first voluntary movement the horse had made all day. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like enough to justify the unlikely journey they were about to begin. The journey home from the Burlington County livestock auction stretched longer than the actual 20 miles that separated it from the Reynolds orchard. Thomas kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the borrowed trailer, half expecting it to sway with the movement of the massive animal inside. But the trailer remained eerily still, as though empty of all but shadows. Mason sat quietly in the passenger seat, his face pressed against the window, occasionally turning to check on a new acquisition through the small rear window of their pickup. The boy's earlier confidence had mellowed into thoughtful silence, but his eyes still held that unwavering resolve that had started this unlikely venture. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" Thomas finally said, breaking the silence, as they turned onto the gravel road that led to their property. "That horse, Titan, he's been through a lot." Mason nodded, his expression serious beyond his years. "I know, Dad. That's why he needs us more." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas couldn't argue with his son's simple logic, though the practical concerns continued to mount in his mind. Their apple blossom orchard was modest by commercial standards, 15 acres of carefully tended trees that provided enough income for the two of them to live comfortably, if not lavishly. The small stable at the edge of the property had been his late wife Sarah's project, her dream of someday adding trail rides as a side attraction for the autumn apple-picking crowd. But Sarah had been gone for 3 years now, and the stable had stood mostly empty, housing only garden equipment and the occasional stray cat seeking shelter. Certainly nothing like the broken-down draft horse they were bringing home. As they pulled up to the barn, their arrival drew attention. Ellie Gardner, their nearest neighbor who helped with the orchard's weekend farm stand, emerged from the small building with a look of confusion. "Thomas Reynolds, what in the world is in that trailer?" she called, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she approached. "I thought you were going to look at ponies, not buy one today." Thomas cut the engine and sighed. "Not a pony, Ellie. And I'm still trying to figure out if I've completely lost my mind." Mason was already scrambling out of the truck, racing around to the back of the trailer. "Miss Ellie, we got a horse. His name is Titan, and everybody else at the auction didn't want him, but we knew he was special." Ellie's expression shifted from confusion to concern as Thomas lowered the trailer ramp and the first view of their purchase became visible. The Belgian hadn't moved from his transportation position, still standing as though carved from wood, his dull coat catching the afternoon sunlight and highlighting every rib. "Oh, Thomas," Ellie breathed, her hand coming to her mouth. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about my son," Thomas replied quietly, nodding toward Mason, who stood at the edge of the ramp, speaking softly to the horse. "I was thinking about Sarah too, if I'm being honest. She would have done the same thing." Ellie's face softened at the mention of Thomas's late wife. "She would have," she agreed, then squinted at the horse again. "But she also would have had a plan. That animal needs serious care, nutrition, veterinary attention, possibly medication." "I know a guy," came a new voice from behind them. Thomas turned to find Jackson Cooper leaning against the fence that separated the orchard from the road. The older man lived a few properties down and had been a fixture in the county's agricultural scene for decades, his knowledge sought after by everyone from hobby farmers to the largest commercial operations in the area. "Word travels fast," Thomas remarked. Jackson shrugged. "Stopped by the auction on my way home, saw what happened, figured you might need some advice." He pushed himself off the fence and approached, his weathered face unreadable as he assessed the horse still standing immobile in the trailer. "Belgian, good breed for farm work, strong, usually gentle-natured. This one's been worked to death, and then some." Mason looked up at Jackson's approach. "He's going to get better, Mr. Cooper. I promised him." Jackson knelt beside Mason, meeting the boy at eye level. His usual gruffness softened momentarily. "Making promises to animals is serious business, young man. They don't understand excuses or change their minds. Once you commit to one, especially." One in this condition, you're in it for the long haul. I know, Mason replied without hesitation. That's why Dad and I are going to do everything we can. Jackson studied the boy for a moment longer, then nodded as though coming to a decision. I know a veterinarian who specializes in large animals, Dr. Melissa Winters. She doesn't come cheap, but she's the best in 3 counties. I can give her a call if you'd like. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, mental calculations of their savings account, competing with the determined expression on his son's face. We'd appreciate that, Jack. Thank you. The next challenge became immediately apparent. Titan refused to exit the trailer. Despite Mason's gentle encouragement and Thomas's increasingly frustrated attempts with a lead rope, the Belgian remained planted in place, his eyes focused on nothing, his massive body a monument to resignation. He's scared, Mason said after their 3rd attempt. He doesn't know this is home yet. Or he's just plain stubborn, Thomas muttered, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. Jackson observed the struggle with practiced patience before offering, he's not being stubborn. He's shut down, seen it before in animals that have been pushed past their limits. Their minds just disconnect. So what do we do? Thomas asked, frustration edging his voice. We wait, Mason answered before Jackson could respond. The boy sat, down on the edge of the ramp, his feet dangling. We show him we're not in a hurry. Jackson's eyebrows rose slightly, an approving expression crossing his face. The boy's got the right idea. Rushing a horse like this will only reinforce whatever negative experiences he's associating with human impatience. For the next hour, they waited. Ellie brought out sandwiches and lemonade, setting up an impromptu picnic beside the trailer. They ate and talked quietly, careful to include Titan in their conversation as though he were another guest at their meal. Mason occasionally offered his apple to the horse, placing it within reach before returning to his spot on the ramp. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when Mason, who had been quietly humming to himself, suddenly whispered, "Dad, look!" Thomas turned to see Titan cautiously shifting his weight, one massive hoof lifting slightly before setting down again. The movement was barely perceptible, but it represented the first voluntary action they had seen from the horse. "Just give him time," Jackson advised, keeping his voice low. "Let him decide." Another 20 minutes passed before Titan took his first tentative step down the ramp. Each movement seemed to require tremendous effort, not just physically, but as if every decision to move forward battled against deeply ingrained caution. Mason remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow with anticipation. When Titan finally stood on the ground outside the trailer, his head lowered to investigate the unfamiliar soil beneath his hooves, Mason's face split into a smile of pure joy. The horse still looked skeletal, his coat dull, his eyes wary, but he had taken the first step, literally, into his new life. "See, Dad? He just needed to know we weren't going to rush him," Mason said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. Dr. Winters arrived just as they were leading Titan to the stable, her truck pulling up in a cloud of dust. The veterinarian, a woman in her 40s with practical clothes and a no-nonsense demeanor, assessed the situation with professional detachment. "Jackson told me what to expect, but seeing is believing," she remarked, approaching carefully with her medical bag. "He's in rough shape, no question about it." The examination that followed was thorough and at times difficult to watch. Winters documented each scar, each sign of malnutrition and neglect, her expression growing grimmer by the minute. Mason stayed by Titan's head throughout, stroking his nose and murmuring reassurances when the horse flinched at the unfamiliar touch. Finally, Winters stepped back, her clipboard filled with notes. Malnutrition, muscle atrophy, probable joint, pain from overwork, and those are just the physical issues. The psychological damage. She trailed off, glancing at Mason's attentive face before addressing Thomas directly. "Can we talk privately for a moment?" As they stepped outside the stable, Thomas braced himself for the worst. Just give it to me straight, Doc. Are we in over our heads? Dr. Winters sighed. Medically, I can help with his physical recovery. Proper nutrition, supplements, pain management, all that I can prescribe. But horses like this, ones that have been broken in spirit, not just body. She glanced back at the stable where Mason could be seen gently stroking Titan's nose. That's going to take something I can't provide. What does he need? Thomas asked, already suspecting the answer. Exactly what he's getting right now, Winters replied, nodding toward Mason. Someone who sees his worth despite his condition, someone with enough patience and love to wait out the darkness. As the sun set over Apple Blossom Orchard, casting long shadows across the newly occupied stable, Thomas realized they had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. For better or worse, they had become the unexpected champions of an animal most had deemed beyond saving. And watching his son carefully arrange fresh bedding around Titan's feet, Thomas felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The sense that something important was happening, something that might change all of them in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Dawn broke over Apple Blossom Orchard with a gentle persistence that matched Mason's dedication. For the third morning in a row, Thomas found his son's bed empty before sunrise, the boy already in the stable with their new charge. Thomas padded across the dew-dampened grass, 2 steaming mugs in hand, coffee for himself and hot chocolate for Mason. The stable door was ajar, and through the gap, Thomas observed a scene that made him pause. Mason sat cross-legged on a bale of hay, reading aloud from a library book about horses. His voice was soft, but clear in the morning stillness, one small hand gesturing occasionally to emphasize a point, as if Titan were an attentive student rather than a traumatized draft horse. Titan stood in his stall, still maintaining the physical distance he'd established since arrival, but his ears were forward, angled toward Mason's voice, a subtle yet significant change from the vacant detachment he'd shown at the auction. The Belgian draft horse has been bred for centuries to be strong yet gentle, Mason read carefully, sounding out the longer words. They were originally war horses in medieval times, but farmers found they were perfect for pulling plows and wagons because they're patient and hard-working. Thomas cleared his throat softly as he entered, careful not to disturb the fragile atmosphere. "Morning lesson?" he asked, handing Mason the hot chocolate. Mason nodded, accepting the mug with both hands. "I borrowed books from the library yesterday when Miss Peterson drove me home from school. This one explains all about Titan's ancestors and what they were bred to do." He looked up at his father with earnest eyes. "Did you know Belgians are one of the strongest horse breeds in the world? They can pull twice their body weight." Thomas glanced at Titan, whose ribs still protruded sharply despite the careful feeding regimen Dr. Winters had prescribed. "I suspect he was quite powerful once." "He will be again," Mason said with unwavering certainty. "Dr. Winters said we just have to be patient with the feeding schedule. Too much too fast could make him sick." Thomas nodded, impressed by his son's retention of the veterinarian's instructions. Following Winters' guidance, they'd established a careful routine of small, frequent meals enriched with supplements. The cost was straining their budget, but Thomas had decided to postpone some orchard improvements rather than compromise on Titan's care. "Any changes this morning?" Thomas asked, sipping his coffee. "He drank all his water," Mason reported proudly, "and I think he slept better last night. His eyes looked different today, more awake." Thomas studied the horse and had to admit there was something subtly changed in Titan's demeanor. The vacant stare had given way to a more alert gaze, though wariness still dominated his expression. "Mr. Cooper said he'd stop by today to help with some grooming," Mason continued, closing his book. "He said it might help Titan remember what positive human touch feels like." As if summoned by his name, Jackson Cooper's weathered pickup truck rumbled up the drive, coming to a stop beside the stable. The older man emerged carrying a wooden box of tools and supplies, nodding a greeting. As he approached, "Morning, Reynolds family," he called. "Thought we might give our friend here a proper welcome to the neighborhood today." Mason scrambled to his feet, excitement evident in his quick movements. "Mr. Cooper brought his special brushes, Dad. He told me yesterday that grooming helps horses bond with people." Jackson set his box down on a nearby workbench, pulling out various brushes, combs, and clothes. "Been working with horses for 45 years, he said, organizing his tools methodically. "Never met one that didn't respond to a good grooming session, no matter how troubled they might be." Thomas watched as Jackson demonstrated each tool to Mason, explaining their purpose with the patience of a born teacher. The curry comb to loosen dirt and hair, the dandy brush for removing the debris, the body brush for polishing the coat, and soft cloths for the face and sensitive areas. "Can I try first?" Mason asked, holding the curry comb reverently. Jackson nodded, but added a caution. "Remember what we talked about. Slow movements. Always let him see what you're doing and respect his space. If he shows signs of distress, we back off immediately." Mason approached Titan's stall with careful steps, holding the curry comb, where the horse could clearly see it. "Hey, Titan," he said softly. "Mr. Cooper and I are going to help you feel better today. This might feel strange at first, but I promise it'll be nice." Thomas held his breath as Mason extended his hand toward Titan's shoulder, half expecting the horse to shy away or show signs of fear. Instead, Titan remained still, watching Mason with cautious attention, but no visible panic. The first touch of the curry comb was gentle, barely making contact with Titan's dull coat. Mason moved in small circles, as Jackson had demonstrated, his movements deliberate and careful. For several minutes, nothing remarkable happened. The horse tolerated the grooming without reaction, neither leaning into the touch nor pulling away. Then, as Mason worked his way along Titan's neck, something shifted. The massive horse released a long, shuddering breath, and his head lowered slightly, the tension in his muscles visibly easing. "Look at that," Jackson murmured to Thomas. "He's starting to remember." "Remember what?" Thomas asked quietly. "What it feels like to be cared for," Jackson replied. "Horses are herd animals. Grooming is part of their social bonding. Somewhere deep in his memory, this feels right to him." The grooming session continued for nearly an hour, with Jackson occasionally guiding Mason's technique, but mostly allowing the boy to develop his own rhythm with Titan. By the end, small patches of Titan's coat had begun to show hints of the rich chestnut color that had been dulled by neglect. "We'll do this every day," Mason declared, carefully putting away the brushes as Jackson had taught him. "And soon his whole coat will shine." Later that afternoon, Dr. Winters returned for her scheduled follow-up. She performed her examination with professional efficiency, noting improvements in Titan's hydration levels and the first slight increase in his weight. "His blood work is still concerning," she told Thomas as they reviewed her findings outside the stable. "But he's moving in the right direction. The supplements are helping with the vitamin deficiencies, and the joint inflammation is responding to the medication." "What about his—" Thomas gestured vaguely, searching for the right word. "His spirit, I guess you'd call it." Dr. Winters glanced back toward the stable where Mason was once again reading to Titan, this time from a different book about horse care. "That's harder to measure clinically," she admitted, "but there are signs. His respiration and heart rate are lower today, indicators of reduced stress. And did you notice he's standing closer to the front of his stall now?" Thomas hadn't noticed, but looking now he could see that Titan had indeed shifted his position, choosing to stand nearer to where Mason sat rather than pressed against the back wall as he had been previously. "It's a small thing," Winters continued, "but in cases like this, the small things matter. They're the building blocks of recovery." The following days brought more subtle changes. Titan began to anticipate feeding times, his ears pricking forward at the sound of approaching footsteps. He no longer flinched when Mason reached for him, and on the fifth morning, Thomas witnessed something remarkable. Titan gently nudging Mason's pocket, where the boy kept apple slices as treats. "Dad, did you see that?" Mason exclaimed, his face illuminated with joy. "He asked for an apple!" Ellie Gardner, who had taken to stopping by each morning to check on their progress before opening the farm stand, clapped her hands in delight. "Well, I'll be. That horse is coming back to life, one apple at a time." The weekend brought an unexpected opportunity when Jackson arrived with the proposal. "Weather's fine today," he observed, looking up at the clear autumn sky. "Might be a good day to try leading him outside for a bit. Sunshine and fresh grass would do him good." The suggestion filled Mason with nervous excitement. "Can we, Dad?" Dr. Winters said exercise would help his muscles once he was strong enough. Thomas hesitated, concerned about pushing too far too fast, but Jackson reassured him. "We'll take it slow, just to the small paddock beside the stable. If he shows any signs of stress, we bring him right back in." The process of haltering Titan proved surprisingly smooth. The horse lowered his head willingly for Mason, allowing the boy to slip the halter on with Jackson's guidance. The lead rope, however, triggered a momentary flash of anxiety. Titan's eyes widened, and his breathing quickened at the sight of it. "It's okay," Mason soothed, stroking Titan's neck. "This isn't like before. We're just going for a little walk together." After several minutes of gentle reassurance, Titan accepted the lead rope. The journey from the stable to the paddock was measured in careful steps, each one a negotiation between past trauma and present safety. Mason never pulled, instead walking slightly ahead and allowing Titan to follow at his own pace. When they reached the paddock, Mason unclipped the lead rope, giving Titan freedom to explore the enclosed space. For long moments, the horse stood, motionless, as if uncertain what to do with this new liberty. Then, hesitantly, he lowered his head to investigate the grass beneath his hooves. "He's remembering," Jackson said quietly to Thomas as they watched from the fence. "Bit by bit, he's remembering what it means to be a horse, not just a work machine." The true breakthrough came unexpectedly. As Mason sat on the grass, watching Titan graze with increasing confidence, a flock of geese passed overhead, their honking calls sharp in the autumn air. The sudden noise startled Titan, causing him to jerk his head up in alarm. Thomas tensed, expecting the worst, a panic response, perhaps even an attempt to flee. Instead, Titan did something no one anticipated. He moved toward Mason, positioning his massive body between the boy and the perceived threat, his stance protective rather than fearful. "Would you look at that?" Jackson breathed, amazement evident in his voice. He's not just accepting care, he's starting to give it back. In that moment, watching his son reach up to stroke the neck of the horse, who had chosen to protect rather than flee, Thomas saw the first true promise of what this unlikely partnership might become. Not just a boy rehabilitating a broken animal, but two souls healing each other in ways no one could have predicted. The October days shortened as autumn deepened across Apple Blossom Orchard. Morning frost decorated the grass like delicate lace, dissolving under the gentle touch of dawn sunlight. Inside the stable, warmed by fresh straw and the solid wooden walls that blocked the chill wind, a routine had begun to take shape around Titan's care. Mason had created a chart on a bright poster board, hung with pride on the stable wall, tracking every aspect of Titan's recovery. Colored stars marked achievements: first full meal consumed, first voluntary approach to the stall door, first time accepting touch without flinching. The chart had become a visual testament to progress that might otherwise seem imperceptible to outsiders. "Look, Dad," Mason pointed out one Saturday morning, adding a silver star to the chart. "That's 2 weeks with no nightmares." Thomas raised an eyebrow as he measured out Titan's morning supplements. "The horse has nightmares?" Mason nodded solemnly. "Mr. Cooper says horses dream just like people. When Titan first came, he would make these sounds at night, and his legs would twitch like he was trying to run away from something. But he hasn't done that for 2 whole weeks now." Thomas glanced at the massive Belgian, who was watching them with alert interest from his stall, a far cry from the vacant-eyed creature they'd brought home from the auction. "I didn't realize you were checking on him at night." "Sometimes," Mason admitted. "When I can't sleep, I just sit with him for a while." The revelation that his 7-year-old was making midnight visits to the stable should have concerned Thomas, but something in the easy companionship between boy and horse reassured him. Mason had always been an unusually self-sufficient child, perhaps by necessity after losing his mother, but his connection with Titan seemed to be nurturing something different in him, not just responsibility, but intuition. Dr. Winters confirmed the physical improvement during her weekly visit, noting the gradual filling out of Titan's frame as proper nutrition began to restore his body. "His blood work is showing remarkable improvement," she told Thomas, reviewing her charts, "and the muscle development is beginning to match his skeletal structure again. He's still underweight, but the trend is distinctly positive." "And the scars?" Thomas asked, gesturing to the network of marks that crisscrossed Titan's flanks. Winters shook her head. "Those are permanent, I'm afraid. The physical ones, at least. But they're part of his story now." As promising as Titan's physical recovery appeared, it was the evolving trust between horse and humans that marked the most significant change. Under Jackson's guidance, they had begun introducing Titan to the wider world beyond his stall and the small paddock. Their first walk down the orchard path had been a tentative affair, with Titan stopping frequently, his massive head swinging from side to side as he assessed each new sight and sound. Mason never rushed him, allowing the horse to set the pace of their explorations, praising each forward step. "You're doing great, Titan," the boy would encourage, his small hand steady on the lead rope. "See that big apple tree? That's my favorite one. In spring, it has pink blossoms instead of white ones." These daily walks gradually extended farther into the orchard, and with each expedition, Titan's confidence visibly grew. By the end of the 2nd week, he was walking calmly alongside Mason, his massive hooves matching the boy's pace with surprising delicacy. The more challenging aspects of trust building came with introducing new stimuli. Jackson had emphasized the importance of controlled exposure to potential triggers, sounds, objects, and situations that might resurface Titan's trauma. "It's like wading into a stream," the older man explained to Thomas and Mason. "You test the waters, step carefully, and never go deeper than you can handle." One clear afternoon, Jackson arrived with a collection of items in his truck bed: a tarp, some gentle bells, a saddle blanket, and other horse equipment. "Desensitization training," he announced. "We'll start slowly, let him investigate each object on his own terms." The tarp proved to be the first significant hurdle. When Jackson spread the blue plastic sheet on the ground outside Titan's stall, the horse froze, his muscles tensing visibly, nostrils flaring with alarm. "He doesn't like it," Mason observed, noticing Titan's discomfort immediately. "Many horses are wary of tarps," Jackson explained. "The sound, the movement, the unfamiliar texture, it can be frightening. But it's important he learns these things aren't dangerous." Over the next several days, they worked patiently with the tarp, first placing it at a distance, then gradually moving it closer, allowing Titan to observe it from his comfort zone. Mason would sit near the tarp, reading his books or doing homework, demonstrating through his relaxed presence that the object posed no threat. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on the 4th day. As Mason sat cross-legged beside the now familiar tarp, engrossed in his reading, he absently reached for an apple in his pocket. The fruit slipped from his fingers, rolling across the stable floor and coming to rest on the edge of the blue plastic. Everyone watched, breath held, as Titan considered the situation. The apple, the reward he had come to enjoy, now lay on the very object that had caused him such anxiety. For long moments, he stood motionless, visibly weighing desire against fear. Then, with deliberate care, Titan extended his neck, stretched forward, and delicately retrieved the apple from the tarp's surface, his lips carefully avoiding contact with the plastic as he claimed his prize. "Well, I'll be," Jackson chuckled. "Smart old boy found a compromise." The next day, Mason placed the apple deliberately in the center of the tarp. This time, Titan's hesitation was briefer before he reached for it. By the week's end, the horse was standing calmly on the tarp itself, accepting treats from Mason's hand, the once frightening object now merely a part of his expanding world. Each new challenge followed a similar pattern, initial wariness giving way to cautious acceptance, and eventually comfortable familiarity. The gentle bells that had once sent Titan into trembling stillness became signals he associated with feeding time. The saddle blanket, initially eyed with suspicion, became something he would actually move toward when Jackson presented it. "He's building a new library of experiences," Dr. Winters observed during one of her visits, watching Mason demonstrate how Titan now allowed the boy to touch his ears, an area many horses guard sensitively. Each positive interaction helps overwrite the negative associations from his past. The most poignant development came not through any structured training session, but in the quiet moments between activities. One rainy afternoon, as Mason sat on a stool in Titan's stall, sketching the horse for a school art project, Titan did something he had never done before. He deliberately rested his massive head against Mason's shoulder, his breath warm against the boy's neck. Mason froze, pencil suspended over paper, hardly daring to breathe. The weight of the horse's head, freely offered in a gesture of trust and affection, brought tears to his eyes. "It's okay," he whispered, reaching up to stroke Titan's cheek. "I've got you." Thomas, who had been observing from the stable doorway, felt his own throat tighten at the scene. The journey from the broken creature at the auction to this moment of genuine connection seemed almost miraculous. Yet it wasn't a miracle at all. It was the product of a 7-year-old's unwavering belief and daily acts of patient kindness. As November arrived, bringing with it the first hints of winter, new challenges emerged. The decreasing temperatures meant Titan needed additional calories to maintain his hard-won weight gain. The horse's increasing mobility created a need for more substantial exercise than their orchard walks could provide. And Mason's school schedule grew more demanding as the semester progressed, requiring adjustments to their routine. Yet through these challenges, the foundation they had built remained solid. Titan now greeted Mason's arrival with a soft, nickering sound that Jackson identified as a specific vocalization of horses reserved for those they considered part of their herd. "That's about the highest compliment a horse can give," Jackson told Mason. "He's telling you that you belong together." One particularly cold morning, Thomas found Mason in the stable earlier than usual, his breath visible in the chilly air as he carefully wrapped Titan's legs with the protective bandages Winters had recommended for additional warmth. "You're getting really good at that," Thomas observed, setting down a thermos of hot chocolate for his son. Mason nodded without looking up, his small fingers working with practiced precision. Dr. Winters said, "It's important to get the pressure just right, not too tight but not too loose either." As Mason finished the final wrap, Titan lowered his head and gently butted the boy's shoulder, a gesture that had become his way of expressing appreciation. "You're welcome," Mason replied, as naturally as if answering a spoken comment. Thomas marveled at the easy communication that had developed between them, a language built of subtle gestures, expressions, and shared experiences. What struck him Most was how this relationship had transformed not just the horse, but his son as well. Mason had always been a compassionate child, but his work with Titan had developed a depth of empathy and patience unusual for his age. "Dad," Mason said suddenly, looking up from his work, "I think Titan is ready for the next step." "What did you have in mind?" Thomas asked, curious about his son's assessment. Mason's expression was thoughtful, his eyes fixed on Titan with evaluating care. "I think it's time he meets more people, not just us and Mr. Cooper and Dr. Winters. If he's going to really trust the world again, he needs to know that other humans can be kind too." The wisdom in his son's observation caught Thomas by surprise. Beyond the practical challenges of rehabilitation, Mason had grasped something essential about healing. That true recovery meant rejoining the wider world, not just creating a safe bubble of trusted individuals. "That's a big step," Thomas said carefully. "Are you sure he's ready?" Mason nodded with certainty. "He tells me when he's afraid now, instead of just shutting down, and he recovers faster when something startles him. I think he's starting to believe that good things can happen. Again." As the first snowflakes of the season began to drift past the stable windows, Thomas considered his son's words. The trust that had been built between boy and horse had created a foundation for something larger, a bridge, back to a world that had once been filled only with pain and demands. "All right," Thomas agreed, watching as Titan nuzzled Mason's hair. "Affectionately, we'll take that step together, all three of us." The first serious snowfall of winter transformed Apple Blossom Orchard into a crystalline wonderland. Tree branches bowed under their white burden, and the paths between the rows of dormant trees disappeared beneath pristine drifts. Mason stood at the window of their farmhouse kitchen, hot chocolate warming his hands as he watched snowflakes dance in the early morning light. "Do you think Titan has ever seen snow before?" he asked, turning to Thomas, who was preparing breakfast. Thomas considered the question. "I suppose he must have, but we don't really know much about where he was before the auction, do we?" The observation hung in the air between them. For all the progress they had made with Titan's physical rehabilitation and emotional healing, the horse's past remained a mystery. Dr. Winters had estimated his age at around 12 years based on his teeth, meaning Titan had lived a decade of life before coming to Apple Blossom Orchard, experiences they could only guess at based on his scars and reactions. "I wish he could tell us," Mason said softly, his breath fogging the window glass. "Then we'd know exactly what scares him and why." Later that morning, as they made their way through the snow to the stable, Mason's words continued to resonate with Thomas. Understanding Titan's past might indeed provide valuable insights into his rehabilitation, but more importantly, it felt like they owed it to the horse to acknowledge his history, to honor the journey that had brought him to them. Titan greeted them with his now customary nicker, his breath forming small clouds in the heated stable. The Belgian's coat had begun to develop a healthy winter thickness, and his once prominent ribs were now covered with enough flesh to give him a more robust appearance. Only the network of scars remained as visible evidence of his former life. As Mason went about his morning care routine, checking water, providing fresh hay, and performing the leg stretches Dr. Winters had prescribed, Thomas noticed Jackson, Cooper's truck, pulling up outside. The older man had become such a regular presence that his arrival barely registered as notable anymore. But today, something was different. Another vehicle followed Jackson's, an unfamiliar white SUV with "Your county government plates." "Morning," Jackson called as he entered the stable, stamping snow from his boots. He was followed by a woman Thomas didn't recognize. Early 40s, professionally dressed despite the weather, with a tablet computer tucked under her arm. "This is Diane Mercer," Jackson introduced. "She works with the County Animal Welfare Department." Thomas felt a flicker of anxiety. "Is there a problem?" Diane quickly shook her head. "Not at all, Mr. Reynolds. Actually, I'm here because of something Mr. Cooper mentioned to me." She glanced toward Titan's stall, where Mason was now watching them curiously. "I understand you've been working wonders with a rescue horse from the Burlington auction." "Mason has," Thomas corrected, nodding toward his son. "I'm just the support crew." Jackson cleared his throat. "Diane has access to records that might help us piece together where Titan came from before the auction. I thought it might be useful information." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward the old horseman. Jackson had understood the importance of Titan's history without being told, had taken the initiative to find answers when Thomas himself hadn't known where to begin. Mason approached, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You know about Titan's past?" he asked Diane, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. Diane smiled gently at the boy. "I have some information that might help us understand his journey, yes. Would it be all right if I meet him?" Mason led the small group to Titan's stall. The Belgian regarded the newcomer with caution, but without the panic he might have shown weeks earlier. His ears flicked forward and back, assessing as Diane stood at a respectful distance. "He's magnificent," she said softly. "Belgian draft. Horses are remarkable animals. This one has clearly been through a lot." "How can you tell?" Mason asked. "The scarring is distinctive," Diane replied. "I've worked with abuse and neglect cases for 15 years. You learn to read the signs." She opened her tablet and pulled up a file. "After Mr. Cooper contacted me, I did some research into auction records and cross-referenced with our department's case histories." Thomas noticed how Mason edged closer to Titan as Diane began to speak, as if physically protecting the horse from his own history. "The auction listing shows Titan was consigned by Westridge Farm," Diane began. "It's a large commercial operation, about 70 miles north of here. They primarily grow corn and soybeans, with some livestock operations as well." "That doesn't sound so bad," Thomas offered. "Farming operations often use draft horses for specific tasks, even in this age of mechanization." Diane's expression tightened slightly. "Westridge has been on our department's radar for some time. There have been several complaints over the years about equipment violations and animal welfare concerns, though never enough evidence for formal action." She swiped through her tablet to another screen. "However, what's interesting is that Westridge wasn't Titan's original home. According to their records, they acquired him only 3 years ago from Blackwater Mining Company." "Mining?" Mason's forehead creased with confusion. What would a mining company want with a horse? Jackson and Diane exchanged a glance that contained volumes of unspoken understanding. Some smaller mining operations still use draft horses for certain tasks, Jackson explained gently, particularly in areas where large machinery is impractical or too expensive. Blackwater operated several small coal mines in the hill country, Diane continued. They were eventually shut down for multiple safety and environmental violations, but before that, they used draft horses to pull carts and equipment. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "Underground?" "They used horses underground in the mines." Diane nodded grimly. "It's an outdated practice, but not technically illegal in this state as long as certain welfare standards are met, which, based on Titan's condition, clearly weren't." Mason's hand tightened in Titan's mane. "They made him work in the dark? Underground?" "That would explain a lot," Jackson said quietly. "His fear of enclosed spaces, his reaction to sudden noises. Mining conditions are harsh, damp, dark, often cramped." Diane consulted her notes again. "According to what I could piece together, Blackwater operated for nearly 6 years before shutting down. Based on Titan's estimated age, he could have spent a significant portion of his life working in those mines." Mason looked up at Titan, with tears shimmering in his eyes. "No wonder he was so scared when we first got him. He thought he was going back to another dark place where people would hurt him." "What happened after the mining company closed?" Thomas asked, dreading the answer, but needing to complete the picture. "Their assets were liquidated, including the work animals," Diane replied. "Westridge Farm acquired several horses in that sale. From their records, they used Titan primarily for pulling heavy equipment, plows, harvesters, timber. Based on the veterinary notations I found, he began having joint problems about a year ago, which made him less effective as a working animal. So they just discarded him," Thomas concluded, the anger in his voice barely contained. "When he couldn't work anymore, they sent him to auction. Unfortunately, that's a common story with working animals," Diane said. "They're seen as equipment, not as living creatures with needs beyond their ability to perform labor." Mason had gone very quiet, his small face solemn as he processed what they'd learned. Finally, he looked up at Diane. "Did he have a name? Before? He was Titan, I mean." The simple question caught everyone off guard. Diane flipped through her notes. The mining company records just list him as Belgian number 4. At Westridge, he was recorded as Draft Horse 17B. "So I was right," Mason said, his voice strengthening. "He needed a real name. He needed to be Titan." Thomas marveled at his son's ability to find the silver lining even in such a grim revelation. Rather than dwelling on the years of suffering, Mason had immediately focused on how they were righting that wrong. Jackson cleared his throat, clearly moved by the boy's perspective. "There's something else you should know," he said. "The kind of work Titan was forced to do. It creates a specific kind of muscle memory and psychological conditioning. It might explain some of his physical issues that Dr. Winters has been treating." Thomas nodded slowly. "The way he moves sometimes, like he's expecting to hit a barrier, and how he seems to brace himself when he hears mechanical sounds." "Exactly," Jackson confirmed, "which means we can be more targeted in his rehabilitation now. Understanding the specific traumas helps us address them properly." Diane closed her tablet, her professional demeanor softening as she regarded Mason. "And Titan, I've documented many cases of neglect and abuse in my career, but far fewer stories of genuine rehabilitation. What you're doing here is quite extraordinary." "It's not extraordinary to treat someone with kindness," Mason replied simply, stroking Titan's neck. "It should be normal." After Diane left, promising to forward any additional records she might uncover, an unusual quiet settled over the stable. The revelations about Titan's past seemed to hang in the air, altering the very atmosphere around them. Thomas watched as Mason methodically groomed Titan, his movements gentle but deliberate, as if each brushstroke could somehow erase years of suffering. "Are you okay, buddy?" Thomas asked finally, concerned by his son's silence. Mason continued, brushing for several moments before answering. "I'm thinking about how dark it must have been in those mines," he said finally, "and how loud, and how Titan had to pull heavy things even when he was tired or scared or hurt." Thomas knelt beside his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's all in the past now. You've given him a new life." Mason looked up, his young face set with a determination that reminded Thomas powerfully of Sarah. "But Dad, that's not enough. There might be other horses like Titan who need help, and that mining company, and that farm. They just get away. With hurting animals?" The question pierced Thomas with its simple moral clarity. In focusing on Titan's rehabilitation, he hadn't considered the larger implications, that the systems that had broken this horse remained unchallenged, potentially creating more victims. "You're right," he acknowledged. "Helping one horse matters enormously, but it doesn't fix the bigger problem. So what do we do?" Mason asked, looking to his father for answers Thomas wasn't sure he had. Jackson, who had been quietly observing their conversation, stepped forward. "We start by giving Titan the best possible second chance," he said, his weathered face solemn. "We document his recovery, we tell his story, and maybe, just maybe, We make it harder for others to look away from what happens to working animals when they're treated as tools instead of living beings. As the snow continued to fall outside, transforming the world into a blank canvas, Thomas realized that Titan's story had become about much more than saving one horse. In uncovering his past, they had taken on a responsibility that extended beyond their small orchard, a commitment to bearing witness to acknowledging a truth most people preferred not to see. And watching his 7-year-old son tenderly caring for the once broken horse, Thomas understood that this journey would shape Mason's understanding of justice and compassion in ways that would last a lifetime. December brought shorter days and a sense of urgency to Apple Blossom Orchard. With winter settling in fully, Thomas worried about maintaining Titan's exercise regimen. The snowy paths made walks challenging, and the frigid temperatures limited the time Mason could safely spend in the unheated sections of the stable. "He needs to keep building muscle," Dr. Winters reminded them during her bi-weekly visit, running her hands along Titan's improving but still inadequate frame. "Without consistent movement, we risk losing the physical progress we've made." The knowledge of Titan's past had added new dimensions to his treatment. Understanding that he had spent years in cramped mining tunnels explained his periodic episodes of anxiety in enclosed spaces. His fear of certain mechanical sounds now made perfect sense. They likely reminded him of mining equipment. Most concerning to Dr. Winters was the evidence of long-term joint strain, particularly in Titan's hind legs and back. "Draft horses, like Belgians, are built for pulling, but not in the conditions he endured," she explained. "The uneven terrain of mine shafts, improper harnessing, and being forced to pull loads beyond his capacity have created structural issues that may never fully resolve." Mason listened to these assessments with the solemn attention of someone far beyond his 7 years, carefully recording each detail in the notebook he had dedicated to Titan's care. His concern was evident as he questioned Dr. Winters about their options. "I can't make it stop snowing," he said, frustrated by the limitations winter imposed on their rehabilitation efforts. "But Titan needs to get stronger." Dr. Winters smiled kindly at the boy. "There are specialized exercises we can do indoors, and therapeutic techniques that might help. But I'll be honest, this is beyond my everyday expertise. Titan needs someone who specializes in equine rehabilitation." "Like a physical therapist for horses?" Thomas asked. "Exactly," Winters confirmed, "and I might know just the person." 3 days later, a mud-splattered truck pulling a horse trailer navigated carefully up the snow-covered drive to Apple Blossom Orchard. Thomas and Mason watched from the kitchen window as a tall woman in practical winter gear emerged, followed by a slender teenage girl. Together, they unloaded equipment from the trailer's side compartment with the practiced efficiency of people. "Accustomed to working as a team, that's Rebecca Sandoval," Dr. Winters explained, having arrived minutes earlier to make the introductions. "She runs Meadowbrook Equine Rehabilitation Center about 2 hours south of here. She's agreed to consult on Titan's case." "And the girl?" Thomas asked, noticing how the teenager moved with the same confident precision as the older woman. "Her daughter Lily, 17 and already one of the most gifted natural horsewomen I've ever seen. Rebecca brings her on most consultations. You'll see why." Outside, Thomas made the introductions while Mason eyed the newcomers with a mixture of hope and protective caution. Rebecca's handshake was firm, her assessment of their setup quick and professional. "Dr. Winters has shared Titan's records and what you know of his history," she said, adjusting her thick scarf against the bitter cold. "I'd like to meet him, if that's all right." Mason led the way to the stable, his protective stance evident as he positioned himself beside Titan's stall, one hand resting reassuringly on the Belgian's neck. "He doesn't always like strangers," he warned, though Titan's demeanor had improved dramatically in this regard over the past weeks. Rebecca nodded, making no attempt to approach directly. Instead, she stood at a respectful distance, her gaze taking in every detail of Titan's physique and posture. "Tell me about his daily routine," she requested, addressing Mason directly. Surprised but pleased to be consulted as the primary authority, Mason detailed their schedule of feeding, grooming, and limited exercise. Rebecca listened attentively, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "And what's his favorite thing to do?" she asked finally. The question caught Mason off guard. Most adults who'd visited had focused exclusively on Titan's problems, not his preferences. "He likes when I read to him," Mason answered after a moment's thought, "and apple slices. And when I brush right behind his ears, he makes this funny noise when I get the spot just right." Rebecca smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. "That tells me something important about both of you," she said. While Mason continued answering Rebecca's questions, Lily approached the stall with quiet confidence. Unlike her mother, she made no attempt to maintain distance. Instead, she leaned against the stall door, her body language relaxed and open, as if she and Titan were already old friends. Titan regarded the teenager with cautious interest. His ears pricked forward in the expression Mason had come to recognize as curiosity rather than fear. "Hey, big guy," Lily said softly. "Looks like you've been through the ringer, huh?" To everyone's surprise, Titan stretched his neck toward the girl, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. Lily remained perfectly still, neither encouraging nor discouraging the interaction, simply allowing Titan to make his assessment. "He likes you," Mason observed with a hint of wonder. Lily shrugged. "Horses can tell when someone understands them. I've been working with rescues since I was younger than you." Rebecca finished her conversation with Mason and approached the stall, careful to mirror her daughter's relaxed posture. "Based on what I'm seeing and what Dr. Winters has shared, Titan would benefit from specialized rehabilitation techniques, particularly hydrotherapy and targeted strengthening exercises." "Hydrotherapy?" Thomas questioned. "Water-based therapy," Rebecca explained. "It allows for movement without putting stress on damaged joints. Ideally, it would be done in a heated pool designed for horses, which we have at our facility." Thomas felt his heart sink. He could already imagine the cost of such specialized treatment, far beyond what their modest orchard income could support. "That sounds intensive." Rebecca seemed to read his concerns immediately. "Normally, I'd recommend bringing him to Meadowbrook for a 6-week intensive program, but I understand that's not practical for everyone, both logistically and financially." "We can't send him away," Mason interjected, his hand tightening in Titan's mane. "He needs to be here with us. This is his home now." Rebecca exchanged a glance with her daughter, some unspoken communication passing between them. "There may be an alternative," she said. "Lily?" The teenager stepped forward. "Mom and I have been developing a modified program for situations like this, where the animal can't come to us. It involves training the owners to perform simplified versions of our therapeutic techniques, combined with regular virtual consultations and periodic in-person visits." "It's not as comprehensive as our full program," Rebecca cautioned, "but for cases where the emotional bond is as important as the physical rehabilitation, which I believe applies here, it can be remarkably effective." Mason's face lit up with hope. "You'd teach us how to help him." "It would be a significant commitment," Rebecca warned. "Daily exercises, careful documentation, absolute consistency in the routines." "We can do it," Mason said without hesitation, looking to his father for confirmation. Thomas nodded, relieved that an option existed that wouldn't separate Mason from Titan. "We're already committed to his recovery, whatever it takes." For the remainder of the day, Rebecca and Lily demonstrated a series of exercises designed to strengthen Titan's core muscles and improve his joint stability. They showed Mason how to use a series of poles on the ground to encourage specific movement patterns, and taught him gentle stretches to perform before and after each session. Most impressive was watching Lily work directly with Titan. The teenager had a gift for communication that transcended words, using subtle body language and energy to guide the massive horse through movements he initially resisted. By late afternoon, Titan was voluntarily performing exercises that would have terrified him hours earlier. "How do you do that?" Mason asked in amazement, as Lily guided Titan through a particularly challenging sidestep movement using nothing but her positioning and the occasional soft click of her tongue. "I listen," Lily answered simply. "Most people only pay attention to what they want the horse to do. I pay attention to what the horse is telling me he can do." Before departing, Rebecca provided them with a detailed manual she had prepared, along with a set of specialized equipment: therapeutic wraps for Titan's legs, a unique halter designed to encourage proper head carriage, and several balance tools for the exercise routines. "We'll set up weekly video calls to monitor his progress," she instructed, handing Thomas a schedule, "and we'll plan to visit in person once a month, weather permitting. Between those visits, I want daily updates, photos, videos if possible, and detailed notes on his responses to each exercise." Thomas glanced at the substantial investment of equipment and expertise the Sandoval's had provided. "The cost for all this?" Rebecca cut him off with a raised hand. "Dr. Winters told me about Mason's campaign." Thomas looked confused. "Campaign?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "The fundraising page? For Titan's care? It's been making the rounds in the equine rehabilitation community for weeks." All eyes turned to Mason, who suddenly found the toe of his boot. "Extraordinarily interesting. I was going to tell you, Dad," he mumbled. "Ms. Ellie helped me set it up. We've been taking pictures and videos of Titan's progress and sharing them online. People have been donating to help with his vet bills and stuff." Thomas was speechless. Between running the orchard and focusing on Titan's day-to-day care, he had no idea his son had initiated a fundraising effort, much less one successful enough to attract attention from professionals in the field. Dr. Winters chuckled at Thomas's stunned expression. "The Titan's Second Chance page has raised nearly $5,000 so far. Your son is quite the advocate." As Rebecca and Lily packed their equipment, the teenager pulled Mason aside. "The most important thing to remember," she said earnestly, "is that Titan will have good days and bad days. Don't get discouraged if he seems to take a step backward sometimes. Recovery isn't a straight line." Mason nodded, soaking in the advice with characteristic seriousness. "I won't give up on him, no matter what." Lily smiled, recognizing a kindred spirit. "That's exactly why he's going to make it." As they watched the Sandoval's truck disappear down the snowy drive, Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "A fundraising campaign, huh? Were you planning to mention that at some point?" Mason looked up, a mixture of sheepishness and pride on his face. "I wanted to surprise you when it got big enough to really help Titan. People from all over the country have been following his story. They believe in him too, Dad." Thomas shook his head in amazement. "You're something else, you know that?" The expertise the Sandovals had brought to Apple Blossom Orchard represented more than just specialized knowledge. It was validation of everything Mason had believed about Titan from the beginning. The horse wasn't merely salvageable. With the right care, he had the potential for genuine recovery, perhaps even a future none of them had dared to imagine. As they returned to the stable to begin implementing the first of many new exercises, Thomas reflected on how their family had expanded in unexpected ways since that fateful day at the auction. What had begun as one boy's act of compassion had grown into a network of support that now reached far beyond their small orchard. January arrived with bitter winds and record-breaking cold that transformed Apple Blossom Orchard into a frozen landscape of white and grey. Inside the stable, however, a revolution was taking place. The rehabilitation program designed by the Sandovals had created a new rhythm to Titan's days, filled with purpose and measured progress. Mason had converted a corner of the stable into what he called the therapy zone, complete with the balance poles, stretching mats, and exercise equipment Rebecca had provided. A whiteboard hung on the wall, meticulously tracking each day's activities and Titan's responses. Beside it was a calendar marking their weekly video consultations with Rebecca and the dates for Lily's in-person visits. The transformation in Titan's physical condition was remarkable. His coat now gleamed with health, the proper nutrition and regular grooming, bringing out rich chestnut tones that caught the light. His frame, once skeletal, had filled out with developing muscle, particularly across his chest and haunches. Even his posture had changed, his head carried higher, his stance more balanced and confident. Yet despite these improvements, one significant challenge remained. Titan still exhibited profound fear responses to certain triggers, specifically dark, enclosed spaces and the sounds of heavy machinery. These fears weren't merely inconvenient. They represented psychological barriers that limited his full recovery. During their latest video consultation, Rebecca addressed the issue directly. Physical rehabilitation is only part of the equation, she explained, her face serious on the tablet screen. For Titan to truly heal, he needs to overcome the fear. Associations from his past, that means controlled exposure to his triggers in a safe environment. You mean like the desensitization we did with the tarp? Mason asked, referencing their earlier work. Similar but more targeted, Rebecca nodded. Based on what we know about his history in the mines, we need to specifically address his fear of dark enclosed spaces and mechanical sounds. Lily calls it facing the ghost, helping the horse confront the shadow of what hurt them. The task seemed daunting. How could they recreate such specific conditions without traumatizing Titan further? Thomas voiced this concern, and Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. We're not suggesting you take him into an actual mine, she clarified. But there are controlled ways to simulate elements of those experiences while maintaining his sense of safety. Lily will be there for your first attempt. She's done this successfully with many rescue horses. After the call ended, Thomas found Mason sitting beside Titan's stall, his expression thoughtful as he stroked the horse's nose. "What are you thinking, buddy?" Thomas asked, settling beside his son. "I'm trying to imagine what it was like," Mason replied quietly. "Being in those mines, being scared all the time, but still having to work." He looked up at his father, his eyes reflecting wisdom beyond his years. "I think that's the worst part, that he couldn't escape even when he was terrified." Thomas nodded, struck once again by his son's intuitive empathy. That's an important insight. Maybe the key isn't just exposing him to what scared him, but showing him he has choices now, that he can walk away if he needs to. Mason brightened at this perspective. Like a practice fire drill at school. Mrs. Gonzalez says we practice. So we know there's always a way out even when we're scared. The simplicity and brilliance of the comparison made Thomas smile. Exactly like that. When Lily arrived the following weekend, they shared this approach with her. The teenager nodded, approvingly. That's actually perfect. Fear responses are worst when the animal feels trapped. If Titan knows he can leave the situation at any time, it changes the entire dynamic. Together, they developed a plan for Titan's first major fear confrontation session. The horse trailer that had originally brought him to Apple Blossom Orchard would serve as their controlled environment, enclosed but not too small, familiar yet still triggering memories of transportation to unknown destinations. The goal isn't to eliminate fear completely, Lily explained to Mason as they prepared. That's not realistic. The goal is to help him develop coping strategies, to show him that he can experience anxiety and still remain in control of himself. They positioned the trailer in the center of the snowy paddock, doors open at both ends, to provide the crucial element of choice. Thomas had removed the center divider to create more space, and Mason had lined the floor with fresh straw and familiar-smelling blankets from Titan's stall. "We'll approach this in stages," Lily instructed, her manner professional despite her youth. "First, we'll just lead him around the outside of the trailer, letting him observe it. Then we'll practice approaching and retreating, rewarding calm behavior. We won't even try to load him today. This is just about changing his association with space." Mason nodded seriously, checking that his pockets were filled with apple slices, Titan's favorite reward. "What if he gets really scared? Then we back off and try again more gradually," Lily answered without hesitation. "This isn't a test he can fail. It's a conversation between you and him, and sometimes conversations take time." They began with simple circles around the trailer, Mason leading Titan with the special halter Rebecca had provided. The Belgian was alert but not panicked, his ears swiveling to track every sound. When they paused near the trailer's opening, Titan's muscles tensed slightly, but he remained responsive to Mason's gentle guidance. "Good," Lily approved from where she observed. "Now walk past the opening without asking him to go in. Just normalize being near it." For 20 minutes they repeated this pattern, approaching, passing by, occasionally pausing but never requesting entry. Gradually, Titan's heightened alertness settled into cautious curiosity. "He's ready for the next step," Lily said. "Now we'll use the approach and retreat technique. You'll walk him toward the trailer entrance, stop before he shows stress signals, reward him, and then immediately walk away. The key is to end each approach before fear takes over." Mason followed these instructions with careful precision. At first, they could only get within 6 feet of the trailer opening before Titan's breathing quickened and his muscles tensed. Each time, Mason would immediately reward him and lead him away, showing him that his discomfort was acknowledged and respected. By the 20th approach, something remarkable happened. Titan himself stretched his neck toward the trailer opening, nostrils flaring as he investigated the familiar-smelling straw inside. "Perfect," Lily whispered, not wanting to break the moment. "That's exactly what we want. Him choosing to explore. On his own terms." They ended the session there, on that note of voluntary curiosity. Titan received lavish praise and treats, the experience concluding with positive associations rather than pushed boundaries. "That was amazing," Mason declared as they returned Titan to his stall afterward. "He was brave." Lily smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "That's the right word, bravery. Being brave doesn't mean not feeling fear. It means facing your fear and moving forward anyway, even if it's just a tiny step." Over the next 2 weeks, Mason continued these sessions daily, meticulously documenting Titan's progress in the notebook that had become a detailed chronicle of their journey together. Thomas observed with quiet pride as his son demonstrated remarkable patience, never rushing the process even when progress seemed painfully slow. By the time of Lily's next visit, Titan was voluntarily stepping his front hooves into the trailer, though he still backed out quickly. The teenager was visibly impressed. "You've accomplished in 2 weeks what sometimes takes months," she told Mason. "I think you're ready for the next phase," adding the element of darkness. This presented a new challenge. They needed to gradually darken the trailer interior without making Titan feel trapped or triggering a panic response. Lily suggested a system of removable panels that could incrementally reduce the light while maintaining the crucial open exit. Thomas constructed these panels from lightweight wood frames covered with dark fabric, designed to hook easily onto the trailer interior. The first panel reduced the light by only about 20%, a barely perceptible change that Titan accepted with minimal hesitation. "We'll add 1 panel every few days," Lily instructed, "but only if he's completely comfortable with the previous level. There's no rush here." The second element of Titan's fear conditioning, mechanical sounds, required even more careful Introduction. They began with recordings of mining machinery, played at barely audible volumes during feeding times to create positive associations. Gradually, over days and weeks, they increased the volume while monitoring Titan's responses. One snowy afternoon, as Mason led Titan through his exercises with the audio playing at nearly 50% volume, Jackson Cooper arrived for one of his regular visits. The older man stood quietly by the stable entrance, observing the session with knowing eyes. "Would you look at that?" he murmured to Thomas. 2 months ago, those sounds would have sent him into a blind panic. Thomas nodded, watching as Titan completed a figure-8 pattern around the balance poles, his attention focused on Mason, despite the industrial rumbling from the speakers. "He still doesn't like it. You can see the tension in his shoulders, but he's managing it. That's the key word," Jackson said. "Managing. Not eliminating the fear, but learning to function despite it." He glanced at Thomas with a knowing look. "Rather like people in that way, isn't he?" The observation struck Thomas deeply. Wasn't that precisely what he had been trying to teach Mason since Sarah's death? Not that grief disappears, but that one learns to carry it while still moving forward. The culmination of this phase of Titan's rehabilitation came on a clear February day, when they attempted the most ambitious challenge yet, leading him fully into the darkened trailer while the machinery sounds played softly in the background. Lily was present for this crucial test, as was Dr. Winters, both standing at a distance to avoid adding pressure. Mason stood beside Titan, speaking softly to him as they faced the trailer together. "Remember, you can always walk out if you need to," the boy murmured, placing his small hand on the horse's massive shoulder. "I'll be right beside you the whole time." Thomas held his breath as Mason took the first step forward, Titan following with visible apprehension. The Belgian's ears flicked rapidly, his nostrils flared, but he continued forward, one deliberate hoof at a time. As they reached the threshold, Titan paused, his body trembling slightly. For a long moment, horse and boy stood motionless at the entrance to the darkness, a symbolic crossroads between past trauma and future possibility. Mason didn't pull or pressure. He simply waited, maintaining contact with Titan's shoulder, a steady presence amidst the fear. Then, with a soft exhale that seemed to release years of tension, Titan stepped forward into the shadowed interior. Mason moved alongside him, maintaining their connection. Together they stood in the dimness for several seconds, not long by objective measures, but an eternity in the journey of trust they had traveled together. When they emerged back into the sunlight, the small gathering of observers broke into spontaneous applause. Titan's ears swiveled toward the sound, but remarkably, he showed no sign of startle or panic, his focus remaining on the small boy at his side. "He did it," Mason announced, his face illuminated with joy and pride. "He faced his ghost." Dr. Winters approached, her clinical assessment softened by genuine emotion. "This represents a neurological breakthrough," she explained. "He's forming new neural pathways, literally rewiring his brain's response to these triggers." Lily nodded in agreement. "The old associations aren't completely gone, but he's building new ones on top of them, ones that connect these experiences with safety and choice rather than fear and helplessness." As they celebrated this milestone, Thomas noticed Mason whispering something in Titan's ear, the boy's expression solemn despite the jubilant atmosphere. Later, when they were alone in the stable, Thomas asked his son what he had said to Titan. In that moment, Mason looked up from where he was arranging fresh bedding in the stall. "I told him that being brave today doesn't mean he has to be brave tomorrow too. That it's okay if he gets scared again sometimes. We'll just keep practicing together until the scary things aren't so scary anymore." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. In helping Titan face his fears, his 7-year-old son had articulated a wisdom about courage and healing that many adults never mastered in a lifetime. March arrived at Apple Blossom Orchard with the first tentative signs of spring. Patches of earth emerged from beneath melting snow, and the earliest bulbs pushed green shoots through the softening ground. The change of season brought a renewed energy to the rehabilitation efforts. With the improving weather, Titan's exercise regimen expanded to include longer walks through the orchard paths and more complex training in the small paddock beside the stable. The Belgian's progress had become a source of local interest. Diane Mercer from Animal Welfare had shared Titan's story within professional circles, and Mason's online fundraising campaign had attracted followers from across the country. Occasionally, visitors would arrive at the orchard, hoping to witness the transformation they'd heard about, the broken auction horse and the determined boy who had saved him. Thomas carefully managed these visits, protective of both Titan's routine and Mason's time, yet he couldn't deny that the growing community of support had become an important part of their journey. The Titan's Second Chance Fund had covered not only veterinary expenses, but had enabled them to purchase specialized equipment that enhanced the horse's rehabilitation. Even more meaningful was how these connections expanded Mason's world. The 7-year-old had developed pen pal relationships with several children from around the country who had been inspired by Titan's story to advocate for animal welfare in their own communities. His teacher, Mrs. Gonzalez, had invited him to give a presentation to his class about rescue animals, an event that transformed the usually quiet boy into an animated storyteller. One crisp Saturday morning, Thomas was reviewing the orchard's spring planting schedule when the sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. Through the kitchen window, he spotted an unfamiliar pickup truck approaching, newer and more expensive than most vehicles that visited their modest property. Mason, who had been preparing for Titan's morning exercises, appeared beside him at the window. "Are we expecting someone, Dad?" Before Thomas could answer, the truck parked and a man stepped out, tall, well-dressed in what appeared to be expensive casual clothing, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He surveyed the property with an appraising eye before approaching the house. Thomas met him at the door, Mason hovering curiously behind. "Thomas Reynolds?" the man inquired, extending his hand. "I'm Preston Westridge. I understand you have something that used to belong to me." The name registered immediately. Westridge, the commercial farming operation that had consigned Titan to the auction after deeming him no longer useful. Thomas felt a protective instinct rise as he shook the man's hand with deliberate neutrality. "Mr. Westridge, what brings you to the Apple Blossom Orchard?" Westridge smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been hearing some rather remarkable stories about a Belgian draft horse purchased from the Burlington auction a few months back. A horse that came from my farm." He glanced past Thomas to where Mason was watching with undisguised suspicion. "I thought I'd come see for myself if the stories were true." Thomas hesitated, unsure of the man's intentions, but reluctant to create a scene in front of his son. "We were just heading to the stable. You're welcome to join us if you'd like to. See Titan." "Titan?" Westridge raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you're calling him?" "That's his name," Mason stated firmly, stepping forward. "It has been since he came home with us." Something in the boy's determined stance seemed to amuse Westridge. "Well then, young man, I'd be very interested to see what you've done with Titan." The walk to the stable felt unusually long, the atmosphere charged with an unspoken tension. Thomas noticed how Mason positioned himself slightly ahead, as if eager to reach Titan first, to prepare the horse somehow for this unexpected visitor. Titan was standing alert in his stall, ears pricked forward at their approach. The Belgian's physical transformation was striking, his coat gleaming with health, his frame muscular and strong, his eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. He nickered softly when he saw Mason, lowering his massive head for the boys. "Greeting, extraordinary," Westridge murmured, genuine surprise evident in his voice. "When we sent him to auction, he was practically a walking skeleton, wouldn't respond to anyone or anything." "He was neglected and abused," Mason said bluntly, his hand protectively stroking Titan's neck. "He just needed someone to care about him." If the accusation in the boy's tone bothered Westridge, he didn't show it. Instead, he approached the stall with a calculating gaze. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Titan. Thomas nodded reluctantly, watching carefully as Westridge extended his hand toward the horse. Titan's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He backed away from the stall door, ears flattening against his head, nostrils flaring in obvious distress. "He remembers you," Mason observed, the realization darkening his expression. Westridge withdrew his hand, his clinical interest undiminished by Titan's rejection. "Memory is a remarkable thing in animals, though I personally had little direct in contact with him. We have staff who handle the livestock." "Why are you here, Mr. Westridge?" Thomas asked directly, tiring of pleasantries. The man turned, abandoning his scrutiny of Titan to face them fully. "To be frank, Mr. Reynolds, I'm here to make you an offer. That horse has become something of a local celebrity, and there's value in that for my operation. Westridge Farms has been considering expanding into organic practices, perhaps even agritourism. A redemption story like this could be quite beneficial for our brand image." Thomas started, momentarily speechless at the audacity of the suggestion. "You want to buy him back?" "At a considerable profit to you," Westridge confirmed smoothly. "I'm prepared to offer $15,000, quite a premium over whatever you paid at auction." "No," Mason's voice cut through the stable, unwavering and absolute. "Titan's not for sale." Westridge's expression softened as he addressed the boy, his tone shifting to one adults often used when they believe children couldn't possibly understand the complexities of a situation. "I appreciate your attachment, son, but $15,000 is a substantial sum. Think of what your family could do with that money. And I assure you, Titan would receive excellent care at our new facility." "The way he received excellent care before," Mason challenged, his young face flushed with indignation. "When you worked him until he was sick and then threw him away." "Mason," Thomas cautioned, though privately he shared his son's outrage. Westridge's smile tightened. "Business decisions are rarely personal, young man. When the horse could no longer perform his function efficiently, we made an economic choice. Now circumstances have changed." He turned to Thomas. $20,000. That's my final offer." Thomas looked from Westridge to his son, then to Titan, who remained pressed against the back of his stall, visibly disturbed by the visitor's presence. "The decision wasn't difficult. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Westridge, but Titan isn't for sale at any price. He's not livestock inventory to us. He's family." Something cold flickered in Westridge's eyes before his businesslike demeanor reasserted itself. "I understand, though I hope you realize that sentiment can be an expensive luxury in today's economy." He glanced pointedly around the modest stable and beyond, to the small orchard. "Should you reconsider, my offer stands until the end of the month." After Westridge departed, an uneasy silence hung over the stable. Mason remained beside Titan, whispering reassurances until the horse's agitation gradually subsided. "He's not going back there, is he, Dad?" Mason finally asked, his voice small but resolute. Thomas knelt to his son's level, meeting his eyes directly. "Never. I promise you that." The rest of the day passed in a subdued atmosphere, their usual routines overshadowed by the morning's confrontation. Though Thomas tried to normalize the situation, he couldn't help noticing that Mason checked on Titan more frequently than usual, as if reassuring himself that the horse remained safely in their care. That night, a spring storm rolled through the valley, bringing heavy rain and gusting winds that rattled the windows of their farmhouse. Thomas awoke just after midnight to check for any damage to the orchard's younger trees. As he pulled on his coat, he noticed Mason's empty bed. Concern immediately spurred him toward the stable. The path was muddy and slick, rain still falling in sheets as lightning occasionally illuminated the darkness. Thomas quickened his pace, anxiety growing with each step. Inside the stable, he found Mason huddled in Titan's stall. The boy's arms wrapped around his knees as he leaned against the Belgian's massive form. Titan stood protectively beside him, unusually alert for the late hour. "Mason," Thomas called softly, relief mingling with confusion. "What are you doing out here?" Mason looked up, his expression earnest in the dim light. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Mr. Westridge said, about his offer standing. Until the end of the month. What if he tries to take Titan while we're not watching?" The fear was irrational, but Thomas understood its emotional foundation. "No one is taking Titan from us, buddy. Mr. Westridge can't just take him. That would be stealing. But what if someone from his farm comes at night? What if they bring a trailer and—" "Hey!" Thomas interrupted gently, settling beside his son on the straw-covered floor. "That's not going to happen. Titan is legally ours. We have all the paperwork from the auction." Mason wasn't entirely convinced. "But Westridge Farms is really big, and we're just us." The simple vulnerability in those words pierced Thomas's heart. Sometimes just us is enough, Mason, especially when we have the truth on our side. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as Titan eventually relaxed his vigilant stance and lowered his head drowsily. The storm gradually subsided, leaving only the gentle patter of residual raindrops on the stable roof. As they walked back to the house in the pre-dawn stillness, Thomas kept a protective arm around his son's shoulders. Westridge's visit had disturbed more than just their Saturday routine. It had awakened insecurities about their ability to protect what mattered to them. The following days brought a subtle but significant change in Titan's behavior. The Belgian, who had been steadily gaining confidence, became suddenly hypervigilant, startling at unfamiliar sounds and showing reluctance during their walks when they approached the boundaries of the property. "It's like he's regressed," Thomas observed worriedly, after Titan balked at the gate leading to the main road, refusing to go further despite Mason's gentle encouragement. Dr. Winters, summoned for an unscheduled visit, examined Titan thoroughly before offering her assessment. Physically, he's continuing to improve, but emotional trauma can resurface when triggered by associated stimuli. Meeting someone from his past likely reactivated dormant fear responses. So Westridge's visit undid all our progress, Mason asked, devastation evident in his voice. "Not all of it," Winters clarified kindly, "but healing isn't always linear. Sometimes there are setbacks, especially with psychological trauma. The good news is that having overcome these fears once, he can do it again, possibly even faster. This time, despite this reassurance, the setback felt crushing to Mason. The boy threw himself into Titan's rehabilitation with renewed intensity, meticulously following every element of their program and adding extra sessions when time permitted. Thomas watched with a mixture of pride and concern as his son demonstrated remarkable dedication, but also took each small regression personally. "You need to pace yourself," he cautioned one evening, finding Mason still in the stable long after his usual bedtime. "Titan's recovery isn't solely your responsibility, but he was doing so well before," Mason insisted, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. "And now he's scared again. I have to fix it." "Some things can't be fixed quickly," Thomas said gently. "They just need time and patience." Lily Sandoval, arriving for her monthly in-person consultation, recognized the situation immediately. After observing one of Mason's intense training sessions with Titan, she pulled the boy aside. "You know what we call this in rehabilitation? she asked, gesturing toward his rigid posture and focused expression. Compassion fatigue. It happens when we care so much about healing someone else that we forget to take care of ourselves. Mason looked up, startled by the observation. But I have to help him. And you are, Lily assured him. But healing has its own timeline. You can guide it, support it, but you can't force it. That's true for horses and people. The teenager's words seemed to release something in Mason. Permission, perhaps, to acknowledge his own exhaustion and frustration. For the first time since Westridge's visit, he allowed himself to simply sit quietly with Titan, their usual training routine temporarily set aside in favor of peaceful companionship. As Thomas observed them from the stable doorway, his son, leaning against the massive horse, both of them seemingly content in the moment, despite the challenges they faced, he recognized that this setback, painful as it was, had offered its own valuable lesson. True healing couldn't be rushed or forced. It required not just determination, but acceptance of the journey's unpredictable nature. That evening, as spring rain once again patterned against the windows, Thomas found Mason adding a new entry to his Titan journal. Instead of the usual meticulous documentation of exercises completed and progress measured, the boy had written something different. Today, Titan was scared of the gate again. That's okay. We'll try again tomorrow. The important thing is that we're still together. April brought renewal to Apple Blossom Orchard. The apple trees burst into fragrant bloom, their pale petals contrasting against newly leafed branches. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the gradual recovery happening in the stable, as Titan slowly regained the confidence that had been shaken by Westridge's visit. He's almost back to where he was, Mason observed one morning, watching Titan navigate the pole exercise with fluid steps that had been hesitant just weeks before. But sometimes he still looks over his shoulder, like he's expecting something. Bad, Thomas nodded, recognizing the behavior, a wariness that hadn't been present before. Though Titan continued to progress physically, a subtle vigilance remained, a lingering effect of having his past suddenly confront him. This new caution became most evident during their walks. Titan would now stop periodically, head raised and ears swiveling, scanning the surroundings before proceeding. Mason had adapted to this change with characteristic patience, allowing these pauses without comment or pressure. Dr. Winters, during her bi-weekly checkup, offered perspective on the behavior. Think of it as an adaptive response, rather than a regression, she suggested. He's not just reacting out of fear anymore. He's actively assessing his environment. That's actually a sign of cognitive health. He's processing information rather than simply responding to triggers. This reframing helped Mason see Titan's changed behavior in a more positive light. Still, everyone recognized that something in their journey had shifted. The easy progress of the early spring had been replaced by a more complex phase of recovery, one that required not just physical strengthening, but a deeper rebuilding of trust. Rebecca Sandoval addressed this during their next video consultation. I think it's time we consider a more significant challenge, she said, her expression thoughtful on the screen. A culminating experience that would allow Titan to demonstrate his recovery in a meaningful way. What kind of challenge? Thomas asked, immediately protective. Something that combines the physical progress he's made with the emotional resilience he's developing, Rebecca explained. Lily mentioned there's a therapeutic riding demonstration at Meadowbrook next month. It's an event where we showcase rehabilitation success stories, horses who have overcome significant trauma to become therapy animals. Mason's eyes widened. You think Titan could be a therapy horse? Not immediately, Rebecca clarified. But the demonstration would be a controlled environment for him to experience something new, being around other horses, unfamiliar people, and moderate activity. It would be the perfect test of how far he's come. Thomas hesitated, concerned, about exposing Titan to potential stress after their recent setback. I don't know. It sounds like a lot for him to handle all at once. Dad, Mason said, his voice carrying unusual conviction, I think he can do it. I think he needs to do it. What do you mean, buddy? Mason struggled to articulate his intuition. It's like Titan needs to prove to himself that he's more than what happened to him, that he can be around people and places that are like his old life, but different because he's different now. He looked up at his father earnestly. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense, Thomas realized. His 7-year-old had grasped something essential about healing, that truly moving forward sometimes required directly confronting echoes of the past, not to relive the trauma, but to demonstrate that it no longer held the same power. If we decide to try this, Thomas asked Rebecca, how would we prepare him? The preparation regimen Rebecca designed was comprehensive. For the next 3 weeks, they systematically introduced elements that would be present at the demonstration. Recordings of crowd noises during feeding times, the presence of multiple visitors during training sessions, and exposure to unfamiliar objects that might be encountered in a public venue. Jackson Cooper brought his own horse, a gentle mare, named Daisy, to help Titan practice being around other equines, something he had not experienced since coming to Apple Blossom Orchard. The first meeting was tense, with Titan maintaining a wary distance, but by the 3rd visit, the horses were comfortably sharing the paddock. That's a good sign, Jackson noted. Horses are herd animals by nature. His willingness to bond with Daisy suggests he's remembering how to be a horse, not just a work animal. Lily arrived for an extended stay the week before the demonstration, bringing specialized equipment to simulate the environment Titan would encounter. Together with Mason, she created an obstacle course that mimicked the route they would navigate. At Meadowbrook, complete with platforms, banners, and various ground textures. The key is making the unfamiliar familiar before we get there, she explained to Mason as they set up. We want him to recognize elements when he arrives, so he has reference points for safety. As they worked through this intensive preparation, Thomas noticed a subtle shift in his son's approach. The desperate urgency that had characterized Mason's efforts after Westridge's visit had transformed into something calmer and more confident. He was still dedicated to Titan's success, but there was an acceptance of the process that hadn't been there before. You seem different, Thomas observed one evening as they reviewed the schedule for demonstration day. Mason looked up from the detailed checklist he'd created. I think I understand something now that I didn't before. What's that? That I can't control everything, Mason said simply. I can help Titan prepare. But in the end, he'll decide what he's ready for. My job is just to be there with him, whatever happens. The wisdom in his son's words struck Thomas deeply. Somehow, through this journey with Titan, Mason was learning life lessons that many adults struggled to grasp. About acceptance, about the limits of control, about supporting without demanding. The day before the demonstration brought unexpected news. Diane Mercer called to inform them that Preston Westridge had requested to attend the event at Meadowbrook. He apparently heard about Titan's participation and expressed interest in observing, Diane explained, her tone suggesting she shared Thomas's immediate concern. Obviously, given the history, I wanted to check with you before responding. Thomas's instinct was immediate rejection, but he paused, considering the complexity of the situation. Let me discuss this with Mason. It's as much his decision as mine. When he shared the information with his son, Mason's reaction surprised him. Instead of the protective anger Thomas expected, the boy was thoughtful, considering the implications from multiple angles. If Mr. Westridge comes, it might upset Titan, Mason reasoned aloud. But also, maybe it's important for him to see what Titan has become. Maybe that's part of the story, too. After careful consideration, they decided to allow Westridge's attendance. With clear boundaries, he would remain at a distance from Titan and have no direct interaction with the horse. Diane promised to communicate these terms and ensure they were respected. The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the outdoor event. Thomas loaded the trailer with everything on Mason's meticulous checklist. Titan's special halter and lead rope, his comfort blanket, the therapeutic wraps for his legs, and a supply of apple slices that had become their standard reward system. Mason was unusually quiet during the drive to Meadowbrook, his expression alternating between nervous anticipation and determined focus. Titan, secured in the trailer behind them, had traveled easily, a significant improvement from his earlier transportation experiences. Meadowbrook Equine Rehabilitation Center occupied 20 acres of rolling pasture land. As they approached, they could see colorful banners marking the demonstration area and rows of chairs set up for spectators. Several horse trailers were already parked in the designated area, and staff in matching polo shirts directed arriving visitors. Rebecca met them as they parked, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "The star participants have arrived," she greeted them, kneeling briefly to Mason's level. "Are you ready for the big day?" Mason nodded, though his hand tightened on the lead rope he carried. "Is there somewhere quiet we can take Titan first? To let him get used to being here before seeing everything?" "Lily set up a preparation area just for you," Rebecca confirmed, gesturing toward a small enclosure separated from the main activity. "You'll have about an hour before your scheduled time in the demonstration ring." As they unloaded Titan from the trailer, Thomas was struck by the Belgian's demeanor. Despite the unfamiliar surroundings and distant sounds of activity, the horse emerged with his head high, ears forward with interest rather than flattened in fear. He stayed close to Mason as they walked to the preparation area, alert but not panicked. "Look at him," Rebecca murmured to Thomas. "That's not the same horse that came to you from the auction." In the quiet enclosure, Mason went through their familiar routine, checking Titan's legs, adjusting his special halter, and performing the calming exercises Lily had taught them. Throughout the process, Titan remained responsive and engaged, occasionally lowering his head to nudge Mason affectionately. "He knows you're nervous," Lily observed, joining them with her clipboard of schedules. "He's trying to reassure you." Mason looked up in surprise. "I thought I was supposed to be reassuring him," Lily smiled. "That's the beauty of partnerships like yours. It goes both ways." She checked her watch. "Almost time. Ready to walk the course once before the audience arrives?" The demonstration area was a large oval ring, set up with various stations that showcased different aspects of equine therapy and rehabilitation. For Titan's segment, they would navigate a simple path that demonstrated his physical recovery, his response to direction, and his newfound trust in human handlers. As they entered the still empty ring, Thomas spotted Preston Westridge taking a seat in the third row, his expression unreadable from a distance. Diane Mercer sat beside him, her presence clearly intended to monitor the situation. Mason noticed too, his step faltering momentarily. "He really came." "We can still change our minds," Thomas offered. "No one would blame you." Mason shook his head, his gaze returning to Titan. "No, this is part of it, all of it." He took a deep breath, then turned to Lily. "Let's walk the course." The practice run went smoothly, with Titan navigating each station with careful attention to Mason's guidance. By the time they returned to the preparation area, the seats around the ring were filled with spectators, a mix of professionals in the equine therapy field, supporters of Meadowbrook's programs, and community members interested in animal rehabilitation. When Rebecca announced it was their turn, Mason led Titan toward the ring entrance, Thomas walking supportively on their other side. Just before they entered, Mason stopped, kneeling to check the wrap on Titan's front leg, an unnecessary adjustment that Thomas recognized as a moment of gathering courage. "You've got this, buddy," Thomas encouraged softly. "Both of you." Mason nodded, straightening with renewed determination. "Let's go, Titan. Time to show everyone who you really are." As they stepped into the ring, Rebecca's voice came over the speaker system, sharing a condensed version of Titan's journey, from the auction, where he had been deemed worthless, to this moment of transformation. The audience listened in attentive silence, many leaning forward to better observe the massive Belgian and the small boy guiding him with quiet confidence. Titan's performance was not flashy or dramatic. He simply walked beside Mason with fluid steps that betrayed no sign of his previous physical limitations, responding to gentle cues and navigating each station with careful precision. What made the demonstration remarkable was the contrast to what had been described, the seemingly impossible journey from broken to whole, from fearful to trusting. When they reached the center of the ring, Mason guided Titan to a stop and gave the subtle signal they had practiced, a light touch on his shoulder combined with a soft verbal cue. In response, Titan lowered himself carefully to his knees, then settled onto his side in a position of complete vulnerability and trust. The significance of this action was not lost on the knowledgeable audience. For a horse, especially one with Titan's history, to willingly place himself in such a defenseless position represented the ultimate demonstration of confidence in his handler. Mason knelt beside Titan's massive head, one small hand resting on the white blaze that marked the Belgian's forehead. For a moment, the pair remained in this tableau of mutual trust, the contrast between the massive horse and tiny boy creating a powerful visual metaphor for their journey together. The silence that had fallen over the audience broke into spontaneous applause. As the sound swelled around them, Titan's ears swiveled curiously, but he remained calm, his focus on Mason unwavering. With another subtle cue, the Belgian rose gracefully to his feet, standing tall beside his young handler as they acknowledged the recognition. Thomas, watching from the edge of the ring, felt his throat tighten with emotion. In that moment, with sunlight illuminating them against the backdrop of spring greenery, boy and horse stood not as rescuer and rescued, but as equal partners who had healed each other in ways no one could have predicted on that winter day at the auction. As they exited the ring to continued applause, Thomas caught sight of Preston Westridge's face. The businessman's practiced neutrality had given way to an expression of genuine amazement, perhaps even a glimmer of regret. Whatever Westridge had expected to see, it clearly wasn't this. A horse he had discarded as worthless now standing, as living proof of potential and resilience, guided by a 7-year-old who had recognized value where others saw only liability. In the quiet area behind the ring, Mason buried his face in Titan's neck, his small shoulders shaking with the release of tension. The Belgian lowered his head protectively, creating a private moment between them amidst the bustling activity. "You did it," Thomas heard his son whisper. "You showed everyone who you really are." Titan's soft, nickering response seemed to say what everyone who had witnessed their journey already knew, that the ultimate test had never really been about proving anything to the audience. It had been about demonstrating to themselves that transformation was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that sometimes the most profound healing happens in the space between souls who recognize each other's worth. The drive back to Apple Blossom Orchard from Meadowbrook was filled with a peaceful quietude, the satisfied silence that follows meaningful accomplishment. Mason dozed in the passenger seat, emotionally spent from the day's events, while Thomas occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror at the trailer where Titan traveled with a newfound ease that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Were nearly home when Mason stirred, blinking sleepily at the familiar landscape passing outside the window. "Dad," he murmured, "did we really do it? Or was I dreaming?" Thomas smiled, reaching over to ruffle his son's hair. "We really did it, buddy. Or more accurately, you and Titan did it." Mason nodded, a small smile playing at his lips as he processed. The day's triumph. Do you think people will remember what they saw today? It was a profound question, one that touched on legacy, impact, and the ripple effects of compassion. "I think some people will never forget it," Thomas answered honestly. "You changed how they see animals like Titan, maybe even how they see themselves." What neither of them could anticipate was just how quickly and powerfully those ripples would spread. The following morning, Thomas was surprised to find several messages on the orchard's business phone. Inquiries about Titan, requests for interviews, and even an invitation for Mason to speak at a regional animal welfare conference. "I don't understand," Thomas said when he called Diane Mercer to make sense of the sudden attention. "The demonstration was just a small event, wasn't it?" "Not as small as you might think," Diane replied. "Several journalists were there covering Meadowbrook's program, and Rebecca had mentioned Titan's story in the press materials. But what really caught fire was a video one of the attendees posted online. It's been shared thousands of times already." By mid-afternoon, the video had found its way to Thomas's inbox, a 3-minute clip capturing Mason and Titan's demonstration, set to gentle music with a simple caption, "Rejected auction horse and 7-year-old boy show the world the meaning of trust." The imagery was undeniably powerful. The massive Belgian moving with fluid grace beside the tiny figure of Mason, culminating in that moment of absolute vulnerability when Titan had lowered himself to the ground in complete trust. The contrast in their sizes, the evident bond between them, and the knowledge of their journey from the auction created a narrative that resonated far beyond the equine community. Mason watched the video with wide eyes, seeing their story from an outside perspective for the first time. "We look like we know what we're doing," he said with wonder. "That's because you do," Thomas assured him. "You two have been teaching each other from day one." The video's unexpected popularity brought an immediate practical consequence: a surge of donations to the Titan's Second Chance Fund. Within days, the campaign that had begun as Mason's modest effort to cover veterinary bills had more than tripled its total, now approaching enough to establish a small foundation for similar rescue cases. Even more surprising was the wave of visitors who began arriving at Apple Blossom Orchard. Some came from nearby towns, having recognized the local setting in the video. Others traveled considerable distances, hoping to witness the partnership between boy and horse for themselves. Thomas initially worried about the disruption to their routine and Titan's potential stress from the increased activity. But to everyone's surprise, the Belgian seemed to thrive with the attention, displaying none of the anxiety that might have been expected given his history. "He's proud," Mason declared confidently after watching Titan graciously accept carrots from a visiting family. "He knows he's doing something important by letting people see him." Dr. Winters, observing one such interaction during her regular visit, offered her professional assessment. "What we're seeing is a remarkable adaptation. Horses are naturally social animals, but Titan's trauma essentially disconnected him from that aspect of his nature. Now he's reclaiming it, learning that human interaction can be positive and affirming." The most significant community recognition came in an unexpected form. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a school bus pulled into the orchard's driveway, discharging a group of elementary school children accompanied by their teachers. Thomas recognized Mrs. Gonzalez, Mason's teacher, leading the excited group. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit," she said apologetically as she approached. After Mason's presentation to our class about Titan, the children couldn't stop talking about him. Then when the video went viral, the principal suggested we make it an official field trip, a living lesson in compassion and responsibility. The children gathered in the stable, sitting cross-legged on clean straw, as Mason, initially shy but growing in confidence, shared Titan's story. Thomas watched with quiet pride as his son explained complex concepts like trauma and rehabilitation in simple terms his classmates could understand, demonstrating a natural gift for communication that had previously been hidden beneath his reserved demeanor. "The most important thing I learned," Mason concluded, standing beside Titan with one hand resting on the horse's gleaming shoulder, "is that sometimes people or animals act scared or mean because bad things happen to them. But that doesn't mean they can't change if someone believes in them." The simplicity and wisdom of his statement struck Thomas anew. In the month since the auction, he had watched his son transform from a quiet, somewhat isolated child into a confident, empathetic individual with a clear sense of purpose. Titan's rehabilitation had certainly been remarkable, but perhaps the more profound evolution had been Mason's own. Following the school visit, Principal Warner approached Thomas with an unexpected proposal. "We've been developing a new educational initiative focused on humane education and emotional intelligence," she explained. "After seeing Mason's presentation today, I wonder if you would consider bringing Titan to the school occasionally as part of this program." Thomas hesitated, protective of both Titan's well-being and Mason's academic time. "I'm not sure how that would work practically." "Oh, we wouldn't want to disrupt Mason's education," Warner clarified quickly. "But perhaps monthly visits? Students could observe Titan's continued progress while learning about responsibility, empathy, and overcoming challenges. We could structure it as an after-school program initially. The idea took root, evolving over subsequent conversations into a formal proposal. Second chances, learning compassion through animal partnerships. The program would bring together rescue animals and children, using their interactions to teach emotional intelligence alongside traditional academic subjects. Mason embraced the concept with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Titan would be like a teacher," he observed, the idea clearly appealing to him. "And maybe some kids who don't like regular school would learn better with him there." As spring deepened towards summer, Apple Blossom Orchard found itself at the center of an expanding circle of community engagement. Local businesses began sponsoring the nascent Second Chances program. A nearby veterinary practice offered pro bono services for future rescue animals. The County Animal Welfare Department, inspired by Titan's story, implemented new protocols for assessing auction animals for rehabilitation potential rather than automatic euthanasia. Perhaps most surprisingly, 3 other families in the region reached out to share stories of their own rescue horses, creating an informal network of support and shared knowledge. What had begun as one boy's impulsive bid at an auction was evolving into a movement, small but significant, rooted in the simple belief that broken beings deserve second chances. Amid this whirlwind of attention and activity, Thomas was determined to protect the core of what mattered, the relationship between Mason and Titan and the peaceful routine of their daily life at the orchard. He carefully managed visitors' access, established clear boundaries around publicity, and ensured that Mason's normal childhood activities weren't overshadowed by his new public role. One quiet evening, as they completed Titan's nightly care routine, they were surprised by an unexpected visitor. Jackson Cooper arrived with his usual unannounced timing, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Preston Westridge, looking considerably less commanding than he had during his previous visit. Thomas tensed immediately, positioning himself protectively between Mason and the visitors. "Mr. Westridge, this is unexpected." Westridge nodded, his usual bravado noticeably subdued. "I apologize for coming without warning. I tried calling, but—" He trailed off, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "What can we do for you?" Thomas asked, his tone neutral but cautious. Westridge glanced toward Titan, who was watching the interaction with alert interest from his stall, showing none of the fear that had marked their previous encounter. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. Since the demonstration at Meadowbrook. About Titan, yes, but more broadly about our operation at Westridge Farms." He paused, seeming to struggle with what came next. "I've been in commercial agriculture my entire life, Mr. Reynolds. 3 generations of treating animals as assets, production units with value measured in output. It's how I was taught, how the entire industry operates." Mason had moved closer to Titan during this exchange, his hand resting protectively on the horse's neck. Westridge noticed the gesture and directed his next words to the boy. "What you've accomplished with this horse, an animal my farm deemed worthless, has forced me to reconsider some fundamental assumptions." "Is that why you're here?" Thomas asked. "To tell us you've had a change of heart?" Westridge shook his head slightly. "Words are cheap, Mr. Reynolds. I'm here because I've made a decision. Westridge Farms is implementing a complete overhaul of our animal management practices, starting with our draft horses." He handed Thomas a folder. "These are the new protocols we're developing, with consultation from Dr. Winters and Ms. Mercer. I'd value your input as well, especially regarding rehabilitation possibilities for animals previously considered expendable." The admission, particularly the painful honesty of that final word, caught Thomas off guard. He accepted the folder, recognizing the significance of what it represented. "That's a substantial change." "It's the right change," Westridge replied simply. "Economically challenging in the short term, but ultimately sustainable both ethically and financially. The public is increasingly concerned with humane practices. We need to adapt or become obsolete." He turned to Mason, his expression softening slightly. "Your Titan has become something of a catalyst, young man. Sometimes it takes seeing something extraordinary to recognize the flaws in what we've always accepted as ordinary." As Westridge and Jackson departed, Thomas flipped through the detailed protocols in the folder, comprehensive guidelines for the care, training, and, if necessary, responsible retirement of working animals. The document represented more than operational changes. It signified a fundamental shift in perspective. "Do you think he really means it, Dad?" Mason asked, watching the visitor's truck disappear down the drive. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think he's trying to, and that's a beginning." Later, as Mason prepared for bed, Thomas found him standing by his window, gazing toward the stable where a security light cast a gentle glow in the gathering darkness. "What are you thinking about, buddy?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Mason turned, his expression contemplative. "I was just thinking about how different everything is now, not just for Titan, but for us too, and maybe even for lots of other horses because of him." "That's called making a difference," Thomas said, softly. "And it all started because you saw something on Titan that no one else could see." "I just saw him," Mason replied with the simple clarity that often characterized his insights. "Really saw him, not just what he looked like at the auction." As Thomas tucked his son in, he reflected on the ripples of change emanating from their small orchard, reaching other farms, schools, communities, and even influencing industry practices. What had begun as an act of compassion had evolved into something larger, a testament to the transformative power of simply seeing the value in what others had discarded. Outside in his stable, Titan stood peacefully in the security light's gentle glow. No longer the broken creature from the auction, but a living symbol of possibility and second chances. Not just for himself, but for an expanding circle of lives touched by his journey. The calendar pages turned as spring melted into summer, bringing long golden days to Apple Blossom Orchard. The apple trees, having shed their delicate blossoms, now nurtured small green fruit that would sweeten and mature in the months ahead. In the paddock beside the stable, Titan's rehabilitation continued with a steady rhythm that matched the seasons. Consistent, purposeful, measured, not in dramatic leaps, but in the quiet accumulation of small victories. On a particularly warm morning in late June, Thomas found himself sitting on the paddock fence, watching as Mason and Lily Sandoval worked with Titan. The teenager had become a regular presence at the orchard, her visits evolving from professional consultation to something more like mentorship. Today, she was teaching Mason a new technique for helping Titan build balance and coordination, skills the Belgian had never properly developed during his years of harsh labor. "The key is to let him find his own center," Lily explained, demonstrating a lunging exercise that encouraged the horse to move in concentric circles while maintaining proper posture. "You're not controlling his movement. You're creating space for him to discover what his body can do." Thomas smiled at the familiar philosophy that had come to characterize their entire approach with Titan, providing structure and support while allowing the horse agency in his own healing process. It was a balance they had discovered through trial and error, learning as much from their mistakes as their successes. Dr. Winters, arriving for her now monthly checkup, joined Thomas at the fence. "I remember when you first called me about him," she remarked, nodding toward the Belgian who was navigating the exercise with newfound grace. "I had my doubts, if I'm being honest." "So did I," Thomas admitted. "Even after we brought him home, there were days when I wondered if we'd taken on the impossible." Winters smiled. "The best lessons often come from the challenges we're most afraid to accept." She glanced sideways at Thomas. "Speaking of challenges, have you given any more thought to the proposal from the State Fair Committee?" The invitation had arrived 2 weeks earlier. A formal request for Titan and Mason to participate in a special presentation at the upcoming State Agricultural Fair. The event would feature stories of animal rehabilitation and welfare, highlighting innovative approaches in an industry traditionally focused on production and profit. "Mason's excited about the possibility," Thomas said. "But I'm still weighing whether it's the right move for Titan. The fair environment would be a significant test, crowds, unfamiliar noises, other animals. Even with all his progress, that's a lot to ask." "True," Winters agreed, though from a rehabilitation perspective, controlled exposure to increasingly complex environments is actually beneficial at this stage. It prevents what we call context-specific recovery, where an animal functions well in familiar settings but regresses in new situations. Their conversation was interrupted as Mason approached, his face flushed with exertion and pride. "Did you see that, Dad? Titan did the whole pattern perfectly." "I saw," Thomas confirmed, ruffling his son's hair. "You're both doing amazing work." Lily joined them, wiping sweat from her brow. "Titan's physical rehabilitation is nearly complete," she reported with professional satisfaction. "His muscle tone, joint flexibility and coordination are approaching what would be expected for a healthy Belgian of his age. He'll always carry some effects from his past, the arthritis in his hind legs, the slight asymmetry in his gait. But functionally, he's becoming the horse he was meant to be." The assessment should have been purely celebratory, but Thomas detected a hint of something else in her tone, a note of conclusion that stirred an unexpected pang of apprehension. "What happens now?" he asked, voicing the question that had been hovering unspoken at the edges of their journey. Lily exchanged a glance with Dr. Winters, a silent communication that confirmed Thomas's intuition. They were approaching a transition point in Titan's rehabilitation. "Now," Lily said carefully, "we need to consider Titan's future purpose." "Purpose?" Mason asked, immediately alert to the shift in conversation. Winters nodded. "Every successful rehabilitation needs to consider the animal's long-term function. What role they'll play, what work gives them meaning. Horses, especially draft breeds like Belgians, are working animals by nature. They thrive when they have appropriate jobs that engage their bodies and minds." "But Titan already has a job," Mason protested. "He's part of our family. He helps with the school program. Isn't that enough?" "Those are wonderful roles," Lily assured him quickly. "But as Titan continues to regain his strength and confidence, he may benefit from having more structured work that utilizes his natural abilities. Not the punishing labor he endured before, but purposeful activity that gives him a sense of contribution." The concept resonated with Thomas in unexpected ways. Wasn't this what all beings needed? Not just existence, but meaning. Not just care, but purpose. He thought of his late wife, Sarah, how she had poured her creativity and passion into the orchard, transforming it from mere livelihood into a labor of love. "What kind of purpose did you have in mind?" he asked. Over lunch in the farmhouse kitchen, Dr. Winters and Lily outlined possibilities for Titan's second career. Their suggestions ranged from light draft work in sustainable farming operations to participation in therapeutic riding programs for children with special needs. The therapy work would be particularly suitable, Winters noted. Titan's own journey of healing gives him a unique sensitivity to human emotion. We've already seen how he responds to different psychological states, his protectiveness toward Mason when he's unsure, his gentleness with younger visitors. Mason listened intently, his initial resistance gradually giving way to thoughtful consideration. "So Titan could help other people the way he helped me?" he asked finally. "Exactly," Lily confirmed. "Many of the best therapy horses have their own stories of recovery. It creates a special connection with people who are facing challenges. They sense that the horse truly understands struggle." As the adults continued discussing logistical considerations, Mason slipped outside, making his way to the stable where Titan was enjoying his post-exercise rest. Thomas watched through the window as his son leaned against the stall door, clearly deep in conversation with the Belgian about the possibilities being discussed inside. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch, enjoying the symphony of summer insects, Mason broke a comfortable silence with a characteristically direct question. "Dad, what do you think was the most important thing we learned from helping Titan?" Thomas considered the question seriously, recognizing it as more than casual conversation. "That's a big question, buddy. I think we learned a lot of things. About patience, about healing, about not giving up on someone just because they're broken." Mason nodded, clearly weighing these answers against his own thoughts. "I think," he said slowly, "the biggest thing I learned is that sometimes you have to let someone change to become who they're really supposed to be, even if that means they might grow beyond needing you the way they did before." The wisdom in his son's observation caught Thomas by surprise. Not just the insight itself, but the maturity it represented. In that moment, he saw Mason not just as his 7-year-old child, but as a developing individual with a capacity for understanding that transcended his years. "That's a profound lesson," Thomas acknowledged, "and probably the hardest one to truly accept." Mason kicked his legs thoughtfully against the porch swing. "I used to think that helping Titan meant making him better so he could be mine forever. But now I think helping him means making him strong enough to be whoever he needs to be, even if that's something different than I imagined." Over the following days, this perspective seemed to guide Mason's approach to Titan's future. He listened with genuine interest, as Lily described various therapy programs, asked insightful questions about what qualities made horses successful in different roles, and began researching online with Thomas's help. One afternoon, as they walked, Titan along the orchard paths, a journey that had evolved from tentative rehabilitation exercise to peaceful shared ritual, Mason made an announcement. "I think Titan should go to the state fair with us," he declared, "and I think we should let him try being a therapy horse afterward, if he likes it." "What changed your mind?" Thomas asked, curious about his son's evolution from protective resistance to acceptance. Mason thought for a moment, his hand resting comfortably on Titan's lead rope. "I realized something about Titan's story. It doesn't really belong just to us. It's bigger than that. If his story can help other people understand about second chances, then maybe that's part of why everything happened the way it did." This sense of larger purpose crystallized when Rebecca Sandoval called with an unexpected development. A documentary. A filmmaker had contacted Meadowbrook, interested in featuring Titan's rehabilitation as part of a series on innovative approaches to animal welfare. It would involve filming at the orchard, interviews with everyone involved in his journey, and potentially following his transition into therapy work, Rebecca explained. The filmmaker is particularly interested in the educational aspects, how Titan's story is already being used in schools to teach empathy and responsible stewardship. The prospect was both exciting and daunting. Thomas worried about the additional attention, the potential disruption to their lives, and most importantly, the impact on Titan himself. Yet there was also something compelling about sharing their experience in a way that might influence broader attitudes toward animals like Titan, those deemed expendable when their utility diminished. "What do you think, buddy?" Thomas asked. Mason, after explaining the opportunity, "It would mean a lot more people knowing about Titan, maybe coming to see him, certainly asking us more questions." Mason considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I think it's like ripples in a pond," he said finally. "When you throw in a stone, you can't control how far the ripples go. Maybe Titan's story is supposed to make really big ripples." The metaphor struck Thomas with its simple profundity. They had never intended to become advocates or educators when they'd brought home a broken horse from the auction. They had simply been trying to help one suffering creature, to keep one promise made by a compassionate child. Yet the ripples from that single act of kindness had indeed expanded far beyond their small orchard. Among the many lessons their journey with Titan had taught them, perhaps this was the most significant. That transformation rarely confines itself to its original purpose. True healing radiates outward, touching lives beyond its intended scope, creating possibilities that couldn't have been imagined at the beginning. As summer deepened, bringing the orchard's fruit closer to harvest, Thomas reflected on this unexpected harvest of their own, the wisdom, purpose, and community that had grown from what had initially seemed like an impulsive decision at a livestock auction. Whatever direction Titan's future took, whatever new chapters awaited them all, the fundamental lesson would remain. Sometimes the greatest value lies in what others have discarded, and the most profound healing begins with simply seeing the worth in what the world has deemed worthless. An understanding that had started with a rejected farm horse and a 7-year-old boy had blossomed into something with the power to transform not just their lives, but potentially countless others. A legacy of compassion that would continue to create ripples long after the original stone had been cast. The state agricultural fair sprawled across the fairgrounds like a vibrant patchwork quilt, each section alive with its own particular energy. Colorful canopies housed exhibits of prize vegetables and handcrafted goods. The livestock pavilions resonated with the sounds of various animals and the voices of their handlers. Carnival rides painted the sky with motion, while food vendors perfumed the air with irresistible aromas. Amid this sensory tapestry, a special tent stood near the education center, its banner proclaiming second chances, new approaches to animal welfare. Inside, a small arena had been set up for demonstrations, surrounded by informational displays and seating for attendees. It was here that Titan's story would be shared with its largest audience yet. The early morning hours before the fair opened to the public found Thomas and Mason preparing Titan in the quiet preparation area behind the tent. The Belgian's coat gleamed in the early light, his powerful frame a testament to the months of careful rehabilitation. Thomas marveled at the transformation, not just in the horse's physical appearance, but in his demeanor. Titan stood calmly despite the unfamiliar surroundings, his eyes alert but untroubled, ears swiveling with interest rather than anxiety as he took in the new environment. "You're being so brave," Mason told him, carefully adjusting the special. Hilda adorned with a blue ribbon, a touch of ceremony for the important day. "Remember, we're just showing people what we already know about you." Rebecca Sandoval approached, clipboard in hand, reviewing the day's schedule. "You'll be the third presentation this morning," she explained. "First is a demonstration of service. Dogs trained by incarcerated youth, then a presentation on wildlife rehabilitation. Your segment is scheduled for 30 minutes, but don't worry about timing. Just tell Titan's story authentically." Diane Mercer joined them, accompanied by a woman Thomas recognized as the documentary filmmaker who had been recording their preparations over the past few weeks. "The tent's already filling up," Diane reported. "Word has spread about Titan's presentation. We've had to add extra seating." As fair staff bustled around making final arrangements, Thomas noticed Mason had gone quiet, a sure sign of pre-performance nerves. Kneeling beside his son, he placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Feeling a little nervous?" Mason nodded, his eyes reflecting both excitement and apprehension. "What if I forget what to say? What if Titan gets scared with all those people watching?" "Then we pause, take a breath, and continue when you're ready," Thomas answered simply. "Remember what you told me. This isn't about putting on a perfect show. It's about sharing Titan's journey honestly, even the challenging parts." This perspective seemed to steady Mason. He straightened his shoulders and gave Titan a final reassuring pat. "We're ready," he declared, his voice finding its confidence. As they waited for their turn, Thomas reflected on the path that had led them to this moment. Just 9 months had passed since that winter day at the Burlington auction when a 7-year-old boy had seen possibility in a horse others had discarded. In that relatively short span, they had witnessed not just Titan's remarkable recovery, but an expanding web of connections and purpose that none of them could have anticipated. The sound of applause signaled the conclusion of the wildlife rehabilitation presentation. Rebecca appeared at the preparation area entrance, nodding that it was time. Mason took a deep breath, grasped Titan's lead rope with practiced confidence, and together they walked toward the demonstration arena. The sight that greeted them as they entered through the side entrance momentarily took Thomas's breath away. The tent was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the edges and even peering in from outside. Among the faces, he recognized many who had been part of their journey: Dr. Winters, Jackson Cooper, Ellie Gardner, Principal Warner, and several teachers from Mason School, even Preston Westridge sitting toward the back with what appeared to be members of his farm management team. A hush fell over the crowd as Mason led Titan to the center of the arena. The Belgian moved with fluid grace beside his young handler, his powerful presence commanding attention without effort. For a moment, boy and horse simply stood together, a living tableau of contrast, the massive draft animal and the small child connected by an invisible bond forged through months of shared purpose. Rebecca approached with a microphone, which she handed to Mason with an encouraging smile. The boy looked momentarily overwhelmed by the sea of faces, but when he glanced up at Titan, something in the horse's steady presence seemed to ground him. "My name is Mason Reynolds," he began, his voice clear despite its softness. "And this is Titan. 9 months ago, he was a broken-down workhorse that no one wanted at the Burlington auction. Today, he's my best friend and a teacher to lots of people about second chances." As Mason shared their story, from the decisive moment at the auction through the challenges of rehabilitation to the expanding impact of their journey, Thomas observed the audience's reaction. There were smiles, nods of recognition, and more than a few discreetly wiped tears. But more striking was the quality of attention, a collective witnessing that honored not just the outcome, but the process of transformation. Mason concluded his narrative by inviting Titan to demonstrate some of the exercises that had been central to his rehabilitation. The Belgian performed each one with willing precision, walking patterns around balance poles, responding to subtle directional cues, and finally lowering himself to his signature resting position that so powerfully symbolized his journey from fear to trust. When Mason opened the floor for questions, hands rose throughout the audience. Many inquiries came from children, their natural curiosity unburdened by adult hesitation. Did Titan ever try to run away? Does he remember the people who were mean to him? Is he happy now? Mason answered each question with thoughtful honesty, neither oversimplifying nor sugarcoating the realities of Titan's rehabilitation. When a young girl asked if Titan would ever be completely fixed, Mason's response reflected wisdom beyond his years. "His body is mostly healed now," he explained, "but some of his scars will always be there. That doesn't mean he's broken, though. It just means his story is part of who he is. The important thing isn't erasing what happened to him, but helping him write a different story from now on." After the formal presentation concluded, attendees were invited to approach Titan individually, a controlled opportunity for the Belgian to experience positive interactions with strangers. Thomas watched with pride as Mason guided each encounter, instructing visitors on the proper way to approach and showing remarkable awareness of Titan's comfort level throughout. As the morning session wound down, Rebecca announced the afternoon's schedule, including a special roundtable discussion on implementing humane practices in commercial agriculture, a panel that would include Preston Westridge alongside animal welfare experts. "The conversation is changing," Diane Mercer observed as she joined Thomas at the edge of the arena. "Slowly, perhaps, but genuinely. Stories like Titan's create openings for dialogue that policy arguments alone never could." Thomas nodded, understanding the truth in her assessment. It's harder to dismiss an animal's value when you've witnessed their capacity for connection and recovery firsthand. The remainder of the fair day unfolded in a blur of activity. Titan's presence drew a steady stream of visitors to the Second Chances tent, each interaction reinforcing what Thomas had come to recognize as the heart of their story. Not just one horse's rehabilitation, but a fundamental reconsideration of relationship and responsibility. In the late afternoon, as the fair's energy began to shift toward evening festivities, Rebecca approached with unexpected news. The governor just toured the education pavilion, and someone showed her the video of Titan's story. She's asked if you and Mason would be willing to meet with her briefly. She's interested in the educational program you've developed with the school. The meeting was brief, but consequential. The governor, a practical woman with a background in education before entering politics, expressed genuine interest in the Second Chances program and its potential application in schools throughout the state. "What you've created is a model for experiential empathy education," she commented. "The research is clear that these types of programs have lasting impact on children's social-emotional development." I'd like to explore how we might support expanding this approach. As they left the meeting, Thomas noticed Mason's thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about, buddy?" Mason glanced back toward the tent where Titan was resting comfortably under Jackson Cooper's watchful eye. "I was thinking about how different things are from what I imagined at the beginning. I thought we were just saving one horse that nobody wanted. I didn't know we were starting something bigger." That evening, as fair visitors gradually dispersed and exhibitors began closing their displays, Thomas, Mason, and Titan shared a quiet moment in the now empty demonstration arena. The day had been filled with public recognition, important conversations, and new possibilities. Yet in this peaceful interlude, what resonated most was the simple reality of their connection, the trust and understanding that had grown between them through daily acts of care and commitment. "Tomorrow we go home," Thomas said, retrieving Titan's lead rope from where it hung on the arena fence. "But things will be different now." Mason nodded, absorbing the truth of this statement. The decisions they had made over recent weeks, to allow Titan to begin training as a therapy horse while maintaining his home at Apple Blossom Orchard, to expand the educational program with support from newly interested sponsors, to participate in the documentary that would share their story more widely, all represented a new chapter in their journey. "Different but good," Mason affirmed, reaching up to stroke Titan's neck. "Like when apple trees change seasons, first blossoms, then small green apples, then finally the harvest. It's all part of the same story." As they led Titan from the arena toward their trailer for the night, the setting sun cast long shadows across the fairgrounds, transforming the ordinary into something momentarily magical. The Belgian walked between them with the fluid confidence of an animal who had reclaimed his strength and discovered his purpose. 1 year earlier, this powerful creature had been deemed worthless, discarded when his utility diminished. Now he moved forward into a future rich with meaning, not despite his past, but carrying it as an essential part of his unique capacity to connect with others who were wounded or struggling. Mason had been right that first day at the auction. Titan had needed them, but what none of them could have anticipated was how much they would need him in return, how his journey would reshape their understanding of value, purpose, and the healing power of patient presence. As they reached the trailer, Thomas watched Mason whisper something in Titan's ear, a private communication between two beings whose connection transcended the conventional boundaries between human and animal, teacher and student, healer and healed. Whatever challenges and opportunities awaited them in this new beginning, Thomas knew with certainty that the foundation they had built would sustain them, a foundation not of perfect outcomes, but of faithful process, of showing up day after day with the simple belief that broken things could be mended, that discarded beings could find purpose, and that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with nothing more than the courage to see possibility where others see only problems. In the gentle exchange between boy and horse, illuminated by the day's last light, Thomas witnessed once again the miracle that had unfolded from that impulsive bid at the Burlington auction. Not just a horse restored to health, but a circle of healing that continued to expand. Touching, lives far beyond their small orchard, creating ripples of compassion that would flow onward in ways they had only begun to imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.